A cold wind brushed through the olive groves of ancient Greece, carrying whispers of gods and mortals entwined in a dance older than time itself. These stories weren't just tales whispered around a fire, they were the heartbeat of a civilization, the invisible threads that held its people together. Across the sea, in the bustling streets of Rome, another wind stirred, a wind heavy with the sound of marching boots, the clash of swords, and the unyielding roar of ambition. Here too, myths thrummed in the air, but their rhythm was different, their purpose sharper, more calculated. Greece stood like an eternal flame, its mythology born in the cradle of curiosity. The gods were larger than life, yet achingly human in their flaws. Zeus, with his thunderbolt, ruled the skies, but was plagued by his own impulses. Athena, goddess of wisdom, had a sharp mind, but carried the loneliness of her intellect. The Greeks did not shy away from showing their deities as complex beings, as fallible as the mortals who worshipped them. In the bustling agora, philosophers like Socrates and Plato would debate the meaning of these myths. Were they literal truths, or something more profound? A shepherd could look to the stars and see the constellations, knowing they were remnants of God's actions, stories frozen in time. A warrior might invoke Ares for courage before battle, while a farmer prayed to Demeter for a bountiful harvest. These myths were everywhere, embedded in every stone, every temple, every heart. They taught lessons, warned of hubris, and showed that even gods could suffer the weight of their choices. Rome, however, was a rising tide, its power sprawling like the rivers that carved through its lands. Where Greece dreamed, Rome built. Where the Greek gods danced in chaos, the Roman ones marched in order. Mythology here was a tool, a sharp-edged weapon wielded with precision. Jupiter wasn't just a god, he was the very embodiment of Roman authority, a celestial mirror of the Senate and the emperor. Mars wasn't merely the rage of war, he was the disciplined strength that built an empire. In the shadow of Rome's grand aqueducts and sprawling forums, mythology was inseparable from the state. Roman children learned of Aeneas, the Trojan hero who carried his father on his back, fleeing the ashes of Troy to build a new world. Aeneas wasn't just a character, he was Rome's origin story, a beacon of duty and sacrifice that every citizen was expected to emulate. The differences weren't merely stylistic, they spoke of the soul of each civilization. Greece found beauty in imperfection. Its mythology was full of tragedy and longing, of love and betrayal. When Orpheus turned back to gaze at Eurydice, he condemned himself to eternal regret, but in that regret lay something deeply human, deeply relatable. The Greeks were unafraid to confront the fragility of existence. Rome's myths, in contrast, pulsed with purpose. They weren't just stories, they were marching orders. Romulus and Remus, suckled by a she-wolf, weren't merely figures of legend, they were symbols of Rome's strength and resilience. Every myth was a brick in the wall of the empire, every god a guardian of its destiny. Where the Greeks saw gods who mirrored their flaws, the Romans saw gods who reinforced their ideals. Yet beneath their differences, there was a shared thread. Both civilizations turned to mythology as a way of understanding the vast, unknowable world around them. They told these stories to make sense of the stars, the sea, and the shifting sands of fate. A Greek sailor might look to Poseidon before a voyage, just as a Roman merchant might pray to Neptune for safe passage. Though the names changed, the essence remained: hope, fear, and wonder wrapped in the cloak of divine intervention. But there was tension in their coexistence. As Rome's legions marched into Greek lands, they didn't merely conquer cities, they absorbed the culture. Roman poets like Virgil and Ovid found themselves inspired by Greek mythology, yet they reshaped it, molding it to suit Roman ideals. This act of adaptation wasn't always seamless. Some Greeks saw it as theft, a dilution of their sacred traditions. Others marveled at how their myths could live on, even under new names and in new forms. The Greek and Roman worlds collided not just on battlefields, but in their very understanding of existence. The Greeks saw the universe as a stage, where gods and mortals played their parts with no guarantees of fairness or justice. The Romans saw it as a machine, with their myths as the gears driving their empire forward. This philosophical divide created friction, yet it also forged something enduring, a mythology that was both timeless and universal. In the end, it was neither the Greeks nor the Romans who claimed ultimate victory in this mythic struggle. The stories they told, their gods, their heroes, their moral struggles, transcended the fall of empires. They lived on, whispered by the winds that continued to sweep across olive groves and ancient ruins, immortal as the stars above. In the quiet of the night, when stars burn brightly against the velvet sky, people have always looked up and wondered about their place in the vastness. Myths were born from these questions, from the desire to understand the forces that shaped their world and the need to find meaning in joy, suffering, love, and loss. But myths are more than stories, they are mirrors, reflecting the values, fears, and dreams of the people who tell them. In Greece, the gods were fierce and flawed, like the humans who worshipped them. They quarreled, loved recklessly, and made mistakes. Zeus, ruler of the heavens, was both a protector and a betrayer. His thunderbolts shook the earth, yet his actions often brought chaos. These myths reflected a world where power was unpredictable, and humans lived at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. It was a land where the line between order and chaos was razor-thin, and survival required cunning, bravery, and resilience. Greek myths captured the fragility of human existence. When Prometheus defied Zeus and gave fire to mankind, he was punished with eternal torment. Yet, in his suffering, there was a defiant spark, a belief that knowledge and progress were worth any cost. The Greeks valued the pursuit of truth and the defiance of tyranny, even when it brought pain. Their myths weren't just about gods, they were about humanity, about every struggle and every triumph etched into the fabric of life. Across the sea, Rome told its own stories. The Roman gods were similar, yet their roles were different, their faces sterner. Jupiter, Mars, and Venus bore familiar names but embodied ideals that suited the needs of a growing empire. The gods became symbols of discipline, order, and the collective strength that built cities and roads and conquered lands. Where Greek myths reveled in the chaos of passion, Roman myths shaped it into purpose. Venus wasn't only the goddess of love, she was the ancestor of Rome itself, the mother of Aeneas, whose courage and piety were the foundation of a nation. For the Romans, myths were not just reflections of individual struggles, but blueprints for a society that prized unity and strength. Romulus and Remus, suckled by a she-wolf, weren't just legendary founders, they were the embodiment of Rome's fierce determination and its belief in destiny. Their story told of sacrifice, fratricide, and the unyielding will to build something that would last forever. Every Roman, from the humblest farmer to the mightiest general, could see themselves in these myths, could draw from them a sense of belonging and purpose. Yet, despite their differences, Greek and Roman myths shared a bond. Both sets of stories spoke to universal truths: the hunger for power, the pain of love, the inevitability of death. Both sets of gods shared human traits: anger, jealousy, generosity, and kindness, because they were born from the same yearning to understand the human condition. When Greeks told the story of Achilles, they revealed the agony of pride and the cost of glory. When Romans spoke of Aeneas, they honored the virtues of duty and the burden of leadership. Both heroes faced impossible choices, and through them, their cultures asked the same question: what does it mean to live a good life? The differences lay in how these cultures answered that question. In Greece, the answer was often personal. Heroes like Odysseus and Heracles were celebrated for their wit and strength, for overcoming challenges through courage and cleverness. Greek myths emphasized the individual, their flaws, their struggles, their victories. In Rome, the focus shifted to the collective. The story of Aeneas wasn't about his personal desires, but about his sacrifices for the greater good. His myth showed that the needs of the many outweighed the needs of the few, that loyalty to Rome was above all else. Both mythologies used their stories to guide behavior, to teach lessons that resonated deeply with their people. When Narcissus fell in love with his reflection, the Greeks warned against the dangers of vanity and self-obsession. When Cincinnatus left his plow to lead Rome in battle, then returned to his farm, the Romans honored humility and service. These stories didn't just entertain, they shaped the moral compass of their societies, teaching what was right, what was wrong, and what it meant to be a part of something greater. And yet, there was a shadow beneath these myths, a sense of longing, of what might have been. The Greeks, with their tragic heroes and capricious gods, seemed to accept the inevitability of suffering. Even their victories were tinged with loss. When Persephone was taken to the underworld, her mother Demeter's grief brought winter to the world. It was a story of renewal, but also a reminder that joy and sorrow are forever entwined. The Romans, in contrast, spoke of destiny with unshakable conviction. Aeneas's path was clear, even when it cost him love and happiness. But there was a weight to this certainty, a sacrifice of personal freedom in the name of duty. Their myths reflected a world where the individual was secondary to the needs of the state, where personal desires were often set aside for the greater good. In these myths, the gods and heroes weren't just characters, they were reflections of the people who created them. They carried the hopes, fears, and values of their civilizations, standing as eternal witnesses to what it meant to be Greek or Roman. And as they spoke of power and love, sacrifice and pride, they reminded their people, and perhaps all of us, that the stories we tell are never just stories. They are who we are. In the beginning, there was nothing but a silence so vast and so deep that it pressed against the edges of existence itself. It was not a peaceful silence, it was heavy, restless, brimming with the possibility of everything and nothing all at once. The Greeks called it chaos, a yawning void where time stood still, where darkness and light had not yet been born. It was from this formless expanse that the universe clawed its way into being. Out of chaos came the first breaths of creation. Night and darkness intertwined, their shadows giving birth to light and day. Gaia, the earth itself, emerged, a steady, solid presence in the endless void. She stretched her vast form, and from her came mountains, seas, and the infinite sky. Uranus, the heavens, became her counterpart, wrapping her in a starry embrace. Together, they set the stage for everything that would come: beauty and war, love and destruction, gods and mortals. But creation was never gentle. The Titans were born of Gaia and Uranus, colossal beings whose power shook the cosmos. Yet their birth brought pain, for Uranus feared the strength of his children. He forced them back into the womb of Gaia, imprisoning them within the earth. Gaia, enraged and aching, turned to her youngest, Cronus, and handed him a sickle of unyielding flint. In one swift, terrible act, Cronus rose against his father, slicing the heavens apart from the earth. Blood fell from Uranus into the sea, birthing the Furies and the giants, and thus chaos bled into creation. Cronus took his father's throne, but fear festered within him. He had seen the cost of power and knew it could be taken just as easily as he had claimed it. Paranoia gripped him, and when his children were born, Zeus, Hades, Poseidon, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia, he swallowed them whole, one by one. It was a grim cycle, parent betraying child, child overthrowing parent. The Greeks told this story not just to explain the universe, but to remind themselves of a truth they could not escape: power is always temporary, and chaos is never far away. When Zeus, hidden by his mother Rhea, finally rose against Cronus, the cosmos erupted in war. The Olympian gods clashed with the Titans in a battle that shook the heavens and split the earth. Thunder roared, rivers overflowed, and mountains crumbled as the young gods fought for their place in the world. It was a war of fire and fury, of ambition and defiance, and when the dust settled, Zeus and his siblings stood victorious. They cast the Titans into the abyss of Tartarus, a place so dark and so deep that even chaos itself seemed a distant memory. While the Greeks wove their myths with raw emotion and endless complexity, the Romans approached creation with a different rhythm. They took these tales of chaos and order and smoothed them, shaping them into something more disciplined, more aligned with their ideals of structure and destiny. In Roman adaptations, chaos remained, but it was less wild, less untamed. The universe was crafted with a sense of inevitability, as if every step of creation had been carefully planned. Where the Greeks saw the Titans as tragic and powerful figures, the Romans emphasized their downfall, using it as a lesson in the dangers of unchecked ambition. Cronus became Saturn, a symbol of time itself, still devouring, still relentless, but now tempered by the Roman focus on order and duty. Even the battle of the gods took on a different tone. For the Greeks, it was a clash of wills, a symphony of defiance and passion. For the Romans, it was a necessary step toward the establishment of divine authority. Zeus, now Jupiter, was not just a god of thunder, he was the protector of law and order, the guardian of Rome's destiny. The chaos of the cosmos was transformed into a story of triumph, of discipline overcoming disorder. But beneath the Roman adaptations, the heartbeat of the original myths remained. The Titans still roared in defiance, Gaia still rose in fury, and chaos still lingered at the edges of creation. These stories, told and retold, reminded both Greeks and Romans of the fragile balance between chaos and order, destruction and creation. There is a truth woven into these myths, a truth that both cultures understood. Creation is never gentle. It is born from pain and conflict, from the clash of forces too vast to comprehend. Yet from that chaos comes beauty, comes life, comes the endless possibility of the cosmos. The Greeks told these stories to wrestle with their own struggles, their own fears of a world that could change in an instant. The Romans, with their hunger for control, reshaped the tales to reflect their belief in destiny and purpose. And so, chaos and cosmos became more than words, more than ideas. They became a pulse, an eternal rhythm that echoes in every corner of the world, reminding us that even in the darkest void, creation is waiting to be born. The night sky hung heavy with stars, each twinkling like a far-off memory. Beneath it, the earth whispered ancient names, names that told stories of gods and their families, of power and betrayal, of love and rage. In the world of the Greeks, the divine was not a single entity or simple force. It was a web, complex and tangled, stretching through generations of gods, each one born from the blood and bones of the last. The family tree of the gods was more like a labyrinth, winding its way through creation, filled with gods, titans, and monsters who were never quite as distant as they seemed. At the very root of this divine genealogy stood chaos, the nothingness from which all things grew. From chaos came the primordial deities, Gaia, the earth, and Uranus, the sky. They were the foundation of everything that came after them. But their story was far from simple. Gaia, full of strength, bore mighty children, yet Uranus, afraid of their power, imprisoned them in the dark womb of the earth. In her pain, Gaia sought revenge, and in that vengeance, the first seeds of divine conflict were sown. It was a tale of family turned bitter, of betrayal within bloodlines. From Gaia and Uranus came the Titans, giants of unimaginable strength. But their reign was short-lived. Cronus, the youngest and most ambitious of the Titans, rose against his father and castrated him, throwing the sky into disarray. But power, once seized, always carries a price. Cronus, who had overthrown his father, became a tyrant in his own right. His own children, born from his wife Rhea, would rise up against him. His fear of losing control led him to swallow each child as they were born. Yet the cycle of fate is unbreakable. Zeus, the youngest of his children, escaped and eventually freed his siblings, leading a revolt that shattered the Titans' rule and cast them into the depths of Tartarus. But even Zeus, mighty Zeus, was not free from the grip of family. His relationships were tangled, his loves and rivalries as complex as the world he ruled. He took Hera, his sister, as his wife, but their marriage was not a peaceful one. Love, jealousy, and revenge twisted their bond. Zeus fathered children with many others, including the beautiful and wise Athena, who was born fully grown from his head. It was a family that mirrored the very nature of the gods, unpredictable, passionate, and, at times, heartbreaking. Hera, his wife, was no passive bystander in this divine drama. She fought back, her jealousy turning to rage. She sought vengeance against the women who had captured Zeus's heart, and her anger often spilled onto innocent mortals. Athena, another child of Zeus, emerged as the embodiment of wisdom, but even she was shaped by the volatility of her divine heritage. She was not born from the usual way, no mother's womb, but from Zeus's own mind, a perfect, armored warrior who held the balance of wisdom and war in her hands. This divine family tree was not a simple, easy-to-follow structure. It was a mess of power struggles, betrayals, alliances, and complex relationships. Every god, every goddess had a history steeped in struggle, making their very existence a reflection of the raw, untamed forces that shaped the world. The Romans, however, saw these tangled connections and chose a simpler path. They looked at the Greek gods and saw power, influence, and, above all, the potential for control. Where the Greeks saw stories of deep emotional conflict and tragic complexity, the Romans saw a way to build something stable, something unshakable. Their gods were not free-willed beings caught in endless cycles of love and revenge. They were symbols of Roman virtues, of authority, order, and discipline. The Roman pantheon borrowed heavily from the Greek gods, but they streamlined the relationships between them. Jupiter, the king of the gods, became the Roman equivalent of Zeus. But where Zeus was a figure defined by his numerous affairs and tempestuous relationships, Jupiter stood as a stoic ruler. His family was simpler, more focused on maintaining power and order. Juno, his wife, was more than just a jealous goddess. She was the protector of the Roman people, the embodiment of marriage, and the mother of the empire. Mars, the god of war, held a central role in Roman mythology. Where Ares, his Greek counterpart, was seen as reckless and bloodthirsty, Mars was revered as a god of disciplined military strategy, the protector of Rome's might and the father of its future victories. Venus, the goddess of love, became not just a symbol of beauty and passion, but the mother of Rome's legendary founder, Aeneas. She was no longer the object of Zeus's desire, she was a direct ancestor of the people who would build an empire. This shift in focus from Greek complexity to Roman structure was deliberate. The Romans needed a pantheon that reflected their own values, control, duty, and the strength of the collective. The divine family was no longer an endless knot of tangled relationships, but a streamlined force that acted in unity for the greater good of the state. Yet, despite these changes, the roots of the Greek family tree still pulsed beneath the surface of Roman mythology. Jupiter might have been simpler than Zeus, but his power still carried the weight of ancient struggles. Juno, while not as vengeful as Hera, still embodied the fierce, protective love of a mother and wife. Mars was not the chaotic god of war the Greeks knew, but he was no less potent. His influence was the bedrock of Rome's military strength, the divine force that turned the tides of battle. In both the Greek and Roman worlds, the gods were not mere figures of legend, they were living, breathing representations of the forces that shaped the human experience. Love, ambition, vengeance, loyalty, and honor, all of these were embodied in the divine families. Yet where the Greeks saw gods as flawed, complex beings caught in an eternal struggle for meaning and power, the Romans streamlined their gods, making them symbols of unity and order. And even as they shaped their divine family tree to fit their needs, the echoes of the Greek gods remained, a reminder that even in the simplest of stories, there is always room for complexity. There was a time when the gods of the Roman world were not entirely their own. Before Jupiter ruled the heavens and Mars commanded the battlefield, there were whispers of a culture far older, a people whose stories shaped the very bones of Rome. The Etruscans. Their influence was subtle, yet it seeped into the roots of Roman mythology like the steady flow of a hidden river. The Etruscans, mysterious and enigmatic, laid the groundwork for what would later become the Roman pantheon, adding their rituals, beliefs, and gods to the emerging power of Rome. In the quiet valleys of central Italy, long before the founding of Rome, the Etruscans had already begun their complex dance with the divine. Their gods were powerful figures, not simply figures of myth, but integral parts of their daily lives. Each deity had a specific role, a purpose tied to the land, to the sky, to the underworld. Their religion was rich with symbols, ceremonies, and rituals that sought to understand the universe and man's place in it. It was the Etruscans who gave the Romans the concept of haruspicy, the art of reading omens from the entrails of sacrificed animals. Through their priests, the Etruscans showed the Romans how to communicate with the gods, how to seek their favor, and how to navigate the forces of fate. It was not just religious practices the Romans inherited from the Etruscans, but also a sense of cosmic order, one that found its way into the heart of Roman mythology. Etruscan gods like Tinia, the sky god, and Uni, the goddess of love and fertility, bore striking similarities to Roman deities. Tinia's role as the sky god eventually merged with that of Jupiter, while Uni's influence could be felt in the later Roman goddess Juno. The Etruscans had already seen the divine as interwoven with human destiny. They had seen how power could shift, how gods could shape empires, and how even the mighty could fall. Their stories of gods and kings were not just tales of distant, divine realms, they were warnings, lessons etched into the fabric of the earth. But it was not just the Etruscans who shaped the Roman view of the divine. As Greece's influence spread throughout the Mediterranean, its shadow began to stretch across the Roman world. Greek colonization, like a slow-moving tide, brought with it the weight of centuries of myth and legend. The Greeks had already perfected the art of storytelling. They had crafted gods with personalities, gods who loved, fought, and lived in the hearts of their people. These gods were not merely divine forces, they were reflections of human nature itself, immortal yet flawed. As Rome grew, so too did its contact with the Greek world. With the conquest of Magna Graecia, Roman writers and thinkers encountered Greek myths and gods. They absorbed these stories as a sponge absorbs water, and like that sponge, the Romans slowly began to reshape their understanding of the divine. Where the Greeks had seen their gods as flawed and emotional beings, the Romans saw them as symbols of strength, order, and destiny. Jupiter, the king of the gods, became the Roman counterpart to Zeus. But where Zeus was capricious, quick to anger and driven by his many desires, Jupiter was more restrained, more dignified. He was a god who stood for law and order, whose power was tempered by Rome's own values of discipline and control. Mars, the god of war, was transformed in Roman mythology from Ares, the chaotic, bloodthirsty Greek god, to a figure who symbolized the disciplined, unyielding might of Rome. He was no longer a god of mindless violence, but of strategy, courage, and honor. Venus, the goddess of love, was another who felt the Greek influence deeply. In Greece, she was Aphrodite, a goddess born of the sea foam, whose beauty could stir the hearts of gods and mortals alike. But in Rome, Venus was more than a symbol of desire. She was a mother of the Roman people, the matron goddess who gave birth to Aeneas, the Trojan hero who would become the ancestor of Rome's founders. She was not merely the embodiment of love, but a protector of Rome's very destiny. The Greeks had created gods who were intensely personal, whose stories were filled with passion, betrayal, and transformation. The Romans, on the other hand, found these stories useful but needed to reshape them to fit their own identity. They took the Greek gods and made them their own, transforming gods of passion into symbols of civic pride, turning divine lovers into embodiments of Roman virtues. This was not a simple borrowing. It was a reshaping of narratives to suit the evolving spirit of Rome. The gods no longer lived in the lofty, dramatic heights of Greek myth. They descended to earth, becoming not just symbols of human desires, but also the guiding lights of an empire. Every Roman citizen could look at these gods and see something of their own lives reflected back at them. Jupiter's unyielding rule mirrored the Roman Senate's power, Mars's warrior spirit reflected the might of Rome's legions, and Venus's role as mother and protector mirrored the Roman ideal of the family as the cornerstone of society. But this was not just a change in the way the gods were viewed. The very nature of the divine had been altered by Greek colonization. Where the Greeks had seen their gods as unpredictable forces, creatures of emotion and chaos, the Romans saw the divine as an extension of their own desires for order and control. The gods no longer played with mortals for sport, they guided them, pushed them forward, and protected their mission. Yet, in this process of Romanizing the gods, something crucial was lost. The Greek gods, with their deep flaws and passions, were not just divine figures, they were mirrors to the human condition. They embodied the complexities of life, the struggles of love, the pain of loss, the folly of pride. The Romans, ever focused on the empire, reshaped these gods into symbols of what the empire stood for: power, discipline, and unity. The very flaws that made the Greek gods so human were smoothed over, turned into virtues to be celebrated. And yet, despite these changes, the legacy of the Greeks and Etruscans remained. The seeds of these older cultures still grew beneath the surface of Roman mythology, shaping the way the gods interacted with each other, with the world, and with humanity. The Greeks had brought their gods down to earth, and the Romans had built them back up into symbols of an empire. The gods, in the end, were never just stories, they were the reflection of the people who told them. And as the Romans wove their own version of these ancient tales, they couldn't help but be shaped by the cultures that had come before them, as much as they tried to reshape them into something new. The moment the first philosophers stepped out of the shadows of myth and into the light of reason, the world began to change. It was as if the stories of gods, titans, and heroes no longer held all the answers. For centuries, the gods had reigned supreme, their capricious wills shaping the fates of men. But then, in the cities of Greece, men began to ask a different kind of question. Why? Not just why did the gods send storms, or why does the sun rise, but what is the nature of reality, and what makes the world work the way it does? The philosophers brought a new light into the darkness of ancient thought. They looked at the world with eyes that sought logic, that sought reason. They began to sift through the myths like an archaeologist digging through layers of ancient stone. Where the gods once seemed to govern everything from the heavens to the underworld, the philosophers believed that reason, not divine whim, could explain the universe's order. Yet, even as they uncovered the secrets of nature, they could not fully let go of the gods. Take Plato, for example, who argued that the world we see is merely a shadow of a higher, more perfect reality. The gods were symbols, he believed, of the divine order, a reflection of a world beyond this one. They were not merely creatures of emotion and desire, but representations of virtues, ideals to strive for. The god stories became more than just tales of passion and drama, they became allegories for understanding the truths of life. Socrates, the questioning soul who had dared to challenge everything, argued that knowledge was the greatest form of virtue, and that understanding the world was the ultimate goal. In this way, Greek rationalism didn't erase the gods, but instead placed them in a new context, a higher, almost philosophical context. The Greeks had always been people of stories, of the gods that walked among them. But as their minds turned to logic and reason, their gods became less personal, less unpredictable. The gods were no longer just mighty beings who threw thunderbolts from the sky or waged wars among themselves. They were symbols, ideas wrapped in human form, teaching lessons about how to live a good and virtuous life. And yet, for all their wisdom, the philosophers couldn't quite break free from the mythology that had shaped their world. The gods still lingered, not in the stories themselves, but in the deeper truths the philosophers sought to uncover. They were not just reflections of human emotion, but reflections of an order, a divine harmony that could be understood only through reason. Meanwhile, across the seas, Rome was growing stronger. Its streets echoed with the sounds of marching legions, its buildings rose higher and higher, and its people forged ahead with a sense of purpose, driven by an iron will. The Romans were not so enamored with lofty ideals and abstract theories. Their minds were practical, utilitarian. The Roman Empire was built on conquest, on organization, on efficiency. It was no surprise that their gods and myths would reflect this. The Romans didn't look at their gods as figures to be revered in the abstract, or as representations of virtues and ideals. To them, the gods were tools to be used in the service of Rome's greatness. Jupiter, Mars, Venus, these gods were not just symbols of cosmic order. They were protectors, providers, warriors. They were the instruments through which Rome could achieve its goals. If the gods were not helping the empire expand, then they were simply not doing their job. The Roman approach to mythology was pragmatic. The gods were useful, but they were also expected to be practical. There was no room for the unpredictable whims of Greek deities. Roman gods didn't play games, they got things done. This shift was clear in the way the Romans adapted Greek myths to fit their own needs. Take, for example, the story of Hercules. To the Greeks, Hercules was a hero who symbolized the struggle of mankind against fate and overwhelming odds. But the Romans didn't focus so much on his trials as they did on his strength, his courage, his ability to get things done. They saw him not as a man who struggled with his own mortality, but as a model for Roman soldiers, someone who represented the relentless drive to conquer and overcome. The Greeks had looked to the gods for deeper understanding, for wisdom and contemplation, but the Romans looked to them for action, for results. And so, the Greek gods were reshaped, filtered through the practical lens of Roman life. Venus, who had been the goddess of love and beauty, was transformed into a goddess of fertility and motherhood, ideals that supported the Roman family structure. Mars, once a god of wild and unpredictable violence, was now seen as a disciplined, strategic figure, embodying Roman values of military efficiency and order. Even Jupiter, who in Greece had been a god of thunder and unpredictability, became the solid, unyielding force that symbolized Roman rule and authority. Yet, as the Greeks pondered the nature of the universe and the Romans honed their focus on practical, military might, something crucial was happening in the space between these two worlds. The Greeks had given birth to rational thought, but the Romans had shown the world how to put that thought into action. The Greeks sought truth, the Romans sought victory. And in the intersection of these two forces, something powerful began to form. The philosophers and the warriors, the idealists and the pragmatists, each in their own way, were shaping the mythology of their time. The Greeks had set the stage for the gods to become symbols of higher ideals, while the Romans made sure those same gods were firmly grounded in the reality of human achievement. Together, these two forces created a mythology that not only served as a mirror to society's highest aspirations, but also as a tool to propel it forward. What is it about the gods that continues to pull at the heart of mankind? Is it their power, their passion, their ability to shape the world? Or is it something deeper, something hidden in the way we look at them, through the lens of reason and practicality? Maybe it is the tension between these two forces, the dreamers who ask why, and the doers who say what now? That gives our myths their eternal power. Zeus stood on the mountaintop, his eyes fixed on the world below, the winds at his back. His power was unmatched. He could summon storms, strike down the proud, and control the very sky. Yet, there was something unsettling about him, something that made even the most powerful gods hesitate. He was a figure of enormous strength, but also of capriciousness. His anger could boil over at the slightest offense, and his desires were as wild as the storms he conjured. His reign was one of awe and fear, where the gods and mortals alike were subject to his whims, his heart ruled by desire, and his justice sometimes cruel, sometimes merciful, depending on the day. Jupiter, the Roman counterpart, stood in stark contrast. His gaze was not filled with wild storm clouds, but with a steady calm, a focused resolve. He ruled not by unpredictable bursts of emotion, but through a quiet, unwavering authority. Where Zeus was prone to passion and fury, Jupiter was the embodiment of discipline, of law and order. His power was not in how he could strike down his enemies with thunder, but in his ability to hold the world together, to create a vision and make it real. Jupiter's rule was not about flashes of dominance, but about sustaining an empire, maintaining stability. He was the god of the Senate, the god of Rome's power, and his personality reflected the Roman ethos, organized, measured, and in control. Both Zeus and Jupiter were rulers of the heavens, but their styles couldn't have been more different. Zeus' reign was turbulent, filled with drama and conflict. His role as the father of gods and men was marked by constant power struggles, betrayals, and his many love affairs. He was a god who lived for the thrill of the moment, who played the game of power with a kind of reckless abandon. He was the god who could overthrow the titans, who could reshape the world at will, but at the cost of constant chaos. His kingdom was one of unpredictability, where divine intervention could come at any moment, sweeping mortals and gods alike into the chaos of his emotions. Jupiter, on the other hand, was not interested in chaos. His rule was not defined by bursts of action, but by his ability to keep order. He was the god of the Roman state, the protector of law, the one who watched over the peace of the empire. Under Jupiter, the universe was not an unpredictable force to be feared, but a structure to be upheld. His power lay not in his forceful nature, but in his calm control. He ruled with a quiet authority that made him revered not just by the gods, but by the people of Rome, who saw in him the same principles that guided their empire: discipline, strength, and the unwavering pursuit of greatness. Zeus and Jupiter were both mighty, both capable of incredible feats, but the way they wielded their power painted two very different pictures of leadership. Zeus' personality reflected the volatile, unpredictable nature of Greek society. The Greeks, after all, were a people who valued individual brilliance, who saw greatness in the pursuit of personal excellence, even if it meant chaos and conflict along the way. The gods, too, reflected this ethos. They were as human as they were divine, ruled by passion and personal desire, capable of both heroism and disaster. Zeus, in his unrestrained power, was the embodiment of this Greek worldview, a world where the gods played with the fates of men as much as men played with the fate of the gods. Jupiter, however, was shaped by a very different world. Rome was built on law and discipline, and its greatest strength lay in its ability to organize, to control, to unify disparate cultures under one rule. Jupiter was the god of this new world, a world where order was paramount, where strength was necessary, but only as part of a greater plan. He was not a god who ruled through raw emotion, but through steady resolve, the symbol of an empire that was built on strategy and methodical expansion. Under Jupiter's watch, Rome would grow, not through sudden bursts of power, but through the slow, deliberate accumulation of strength. This contrast was not just a difference in the gods themselves, but in how they were worshipped and what they represented to their respective societies. In Greece, Zeus was not only a figure of power, but a reminder of the unpredictability of the world. He could be generous one moment and vengeful the next, much like the tides of fortune that the Greeks believed shaped their lives. To worship Zeus was to acknowledge the capriciousness of fate, to accept that even the mightiest could be brought low by the whims of the gods. Greek worship of Zeus was often intense, driven by the need to appease him, to ensure his favor in the chaos of their world. The sacrifices, the prayers, the offerings, these were all ways to seek favor from a god who could never truly be predicted. Jupiter's worship in Rome, however, reflected the Roman desire for stability and control. Jupiter was not just the god of the sky, he was the god of Roman law and the state. To worship Jupiter was to reaffirm loyalty to Rome itself. The Roman people did not seek to appease a god who might strike them down in an instant. Instead, they looked to Jupiter for guidance, for strength in their collective ambition. His temples were places of solemnity and order, not of fervent plea, but of quiet respect. He was the god who ensured that the empire would not fall into disarray, the protector of the Senate, the guardian of Rome's sacred laws. In Rome, the emperor was often seen as the living embodiment of Jupiter's power, and his divine right to rule was justified through Jupiter's steady hand. The emperor, like Jupiter, was a symbol of Rome's commitment to stability, to the idea that the empire would remain strong and organized, no matter the chaos brewing outside its borders. While the Greeks looked to their gods as examples of greatness and personal ambition, the Romans saw their gods as tools for maintaining order, tools that allowed them to expand their empire, to enforce their laws, and to ensure that power would remain in the hands of the state. Zeus and Jupiter, in their contrasting personalities, embodied the two sides of the ancient world, the chaotic, passionate energy of Greece, and the ordered, disciplined power of Rome. Both gods were symbols of leadership, but their leadership styles spoke to very different values. Zeus ruled through force, through the power of his emotions, while Jupiter ruled through structure, through the power of his ability to maintain control. One god sought to inspire awe and fear, the other sought to inspire loyalty and stability. And in this contrast, we see the heart of what made these two civilizations so profoundly different, and what made their myths, their gods, and their empires so unforgettable. Hera stood tall, her eyes burning with a cold fury as she gazed upon her husband, Zeus, the king of gods. The weight of his infidelity pressed heavily on her chest. His countless affairs, his endless promises, his reckless lust had shattered the trust between them, yet her love for him remained undeniable. Each time she caught wind of his latest betrayal, it was as if a dagger plunged deep into her heart. She would confront him, demanding respect, only to be met with his charming apologies or empty reassurances. But the truth never changed, he was always slipping from her grasp. Her jealousy was not just born of love. It was born of hurt, of a deep, searing pain that never seemed to ease. Hera, as the queen of the gods, ruled with majesty and power, but her throne was constantly threatened by the shadows of Zeus's other women and children. Her pride, once unshakable, became bruised and battered, until even the love she held for her husband began to twist into something darker, more dangerous. Her jealousy seeped into everything she did. It made her cruel and vengeful, particularly toward those who were a threat to her marriage, mortal women, nymphs, and even goddesses who had caught the eye of Zeus. To her, this was not just about love, it was about control, about the preservation of her dignity. She was the queen, yet she felt as if she had no power over the one being who should have respected her above all others. In contrast, Juno, her Roman counterpart, ruled with a different kind of authority. While she too was a goddess of marriage and family, Juno's role had grown more tied to the state, to the power of Rome itself. She was no longer just the wife of Jupiter, with her heart torn by the same heartbreak and jealousy that had consumed Hera. Juno was more than that. She was the protector of the Roman people, the goddess who watched over women, marriage, and childbirth, but in a more detached, institutional way. Her marriage to Jupiter was not just about love or betrayal, it was about the stability of Rome, the preservation of Roman values. To Juno, family was a symbol of society's strength. She was the guardian of the Roman state, and her personal struggles seemed secondary to her broader responsibilities. Yet, beneath this cold exterior, there was still a woman who could feel the weight of betrayal. Jupiter's affairs, like Zeus's, could not be ignored, but Juno's reaction was different. She didn't fly into fits of rage or bitterness. Instead, she channeled her energy into maintaining control of her role, of her marriage, of the Roman Empire. It was not passion that fueled Juno's decisions, but duty. She was the perfect representation of Roman pragmatism. Marriage was a political institution, and Juno's place within it was not merely as a wife, but as a symbol of Roman unity and strength. She had to rise above the personal for the sake of the greater good. Where Hera's jealousy often turned into a burning, destructive fire, Juno's response was more strategic. She would look at her husband's infidelities and sometimes even accept them, not because she condoned them, but because she understood that the balance of power was more important than her personal emotions. The stability of Rome was more important than her pride. Her role was that of the steadfast protector, not the emotional victim. Juno's frustration may have been buried deep within her, but it was always controlled, always managed in the service of the greater Roman good. Yet, the pain of being a queen in such a way still remained. Hera's passionate emotions may have made her more relatable, but Juno's sense of duty, her ability to rise above, may have been even more heart-wrenching in its own way. It wasn't the immediate, fiery jealousy that consumed her, but the slow, painful understanding that sometimes she had to hold her pain in silence, for the sake of the empire she had to protect. She could not let personal weakness show, she had to remain the face of strength. The more she tried to hold it together, the more her own identity faded into the background of the grand political game that was marriage to Jupiter. Hera's struggles were raw and honest. She loved deeply, but she also hated fiercely. Every moment of Zeus's infidelity was a stab to her soul. Yet, in her anger, in her vengeful acts, she remained the heart of Greek domestic life, a goddess who ruled over the sacred bonds of marriage with her own tumultuous, emotional energy. Hera was the goddess who loved as intensely as she hated, who could destroy the lives of mortals and immortals alike with a single word, but also who could love her children fiercely enough to challenge even the mightiest gods to protect them. Juno, in contrast, was colder, more composed, and more pragmatic. The Roman state demanded that she be above personal emotion. Her identity, her power, her role were all wrapped in the idea of the empire. To her, marriage was not just about the bond between two gods, it was a symbol of the strength and unity of the Roman people. The goddess of marriage had become the goddess of statecraft, her devotion to her marriage woven into the fabric of Roman society itself. Juno may have seen herself as a queen of the heavens, but her kingdom was no longer just about love, it was about law, order, and the greater good of the empire. In this dynamic, Hera and Juno became more than just the wives of the gods. They became reflections of two very different societies, one that reveled in personal passions and the other that sought to maintain its power through control and order. Hera's fierce, emotional love mirrored the Greek way of life, chaotic, intense, unpredictable, yet deeply personal. Juno, with her cold sense of duty, mirrored the Roman world, structured, focused on the collective, where even the personal was secondary to the needs of the state. And yet, both goddesses carried a deep, poignant sadness. Hera's sadness was born from betrayal, from the constant struggle to keep her family intact, even as it tore her apart. Juno's sadness was quieter, more internalized, a sorrow wrapped in duty and responsibility. Both queens of heaven, both women who carried the weight of the world on their shoulders, one in anger, one in silence, held the complexities of marriage, of power, and of duty in their hearts. The thunder cracked across the horizon, and with it, the deep roar of the sea followed. The waves swelled, towering above ships, crashing against the shore with a force that seemed almost alive. Poseidon, god of the oceans, stood at the edge of a cliff, his trident held high, eyes darkened by the storm he had just summoned. His rage was a reflection of the tempest inside him, a furious, unrelenting force that mirrored his personality, untamed, unpredictable, a god whose every mood shifted as swiftly as the tides he ruled. Poseidon's temperament was as vast and dangerous as the seas themselves. One moment, he could bring calm, guiding sailors safely to their destinations. The next, he could raise the ocean in a violent frenzy, capsizing ships and swallowing men whole, just as easily. The sea was his to command, and in his hands, it was both a source of life and a force of destruction. The Greeks understood this duality in their god. He wasn't simply the god of water, he was the god of power, of uncontrollable forces that had the ability to build and destroy in equal measure. To the Greeks, Poseidon was as much a part of the world's volatile nature as the wind and the sky, an embodiment of forces that couldn't always be reasoned with or understood. Neptune, his Roman counterpart, was something else entirely. His domain was still the sea, but his role in the Roman world was shaped by a different kind of order. Where Poseidon's moods shifted like the waves, Neptune was more restrained. His temperament was calmer, more predictable. The Romans, in their empire-building nature, needed a god who would represent the sea not as an untamable force, but as something they could harness, something they could control. Neptune was not the unpredictable force of nature that Poseidon was. He was a god who brought prosperity and wealth through the seas, a protector of Roman sailors, guiding them across the waters with a steady hand. The difference between the two gods could be seen in the way the Romans viewed their sea power. For them, the sea was not an unpredictable threat, but a tool, a means to expand their empire. Neptune's role was to keep the Romans' dominance over the Mediterranean, ensuring that their ships could travel safely, that their trade routes remained open, that their empire could continue to grow. There was no room for the kind of chaotic violence that Poseidon represented. The Romans revered Neptune not just as a god of the sea, but as a symbol of their control over the natural world. The sea was no longer just a wild beast, it was something that could be tamed, something that could be used to further their ambitions. Poseidon, however, remained wild, his unpredictability and power a reflection of Greek society itself. The Greeks understood that the sea could give life, but it could also take it away in the blink of an eye. For a Greek sailor, the sea was as much a source of terror as it was a path to glory. The myth of Poseidon was not one of stability or prosperity, but one of constant change, of forces that could not always be controlled. His domain was not a realm of predictability, it was a realm of mystery, a realm that could shift from calm to chaos at any given moment. The Greeks had no illusions about the sea. It was not their servant, it was their master, one that they could only hope to understand and navigate, never fully control. This difference between Poseidon and Neptune was reflected in their worship. The Greeks would offer sacrifices to Poseidon in the hopes of calming the storm or earning favor during dangerous voyages. The rituals were often filled with uncertainty, a recognition that the gods were fickle, that no amount of preparation could shield sailors from Poseidon's wrath. It was a relationship defined by a certain humility, a recognition that the gods and the forces of nature were always one step ahead of human will. For the Greeks, Poseidon was a god who could be reasoned with, but he was also a god who could be enraged. He embodied the dangers of the unknown, and so, the Greeks never took him lightly. In contrast, the Romans viewed Neptune through the lens of pragmatism. They didn't see the sea as something that could just be feared and worshipped, they saw it as a means to achieve their goals. Neptune's favor was not a matter of appeasing him to avoid his fury, it was about ensuring that the sea could be an ally in their conquests. The Roman world was built on order, and Neptune, in their eyes, was another piece in the grand puzzle of their empire. He was a god whose power was meant to be harnessed, a god whose seas were under control, not one who ruled through unpredictable temperaments and sudden storms. For the Romans, the relationship with Neptune was about control, not chaos. Yet, despite these differences in temperament, both Poseidon and Neptune shared the same underlying connection to the sea. They were both lords of the vast, deep waters that made up the majority of the world, gods whose domains stretched beyond what the eye could see. The sea represented life, but it also represented a kind of death. Its depths held the unknown, and its currents could swallow entire fleets. Both Poseidon and Neptune had to embody that duality, balancing creation and destruction, prosperity and ruin, even if they expressed it in vastly different ways. The sea, in both Greek and Roman culture, was a source of power, both physical and symbolic. It connected worlds, cultures, and ideas, and in both mythologies, the gods of the sea were at the center of it all. But how each culture viewed that power shaped their depiction of their gods. Poseidon's personality was shaped by the Greek belief in the untamable nature of life, the constant turmoil, the beauty and terror of the world that could never fully be controlled. Neptune, on the other hand, was shaped by the Roman belief in order, in the possibility of subduing nature to their will, and in the role of the sea as a tool for expansion. The waves still crash against the shore, whether they are commanded by Poseidon or Neptune. But it is in the hearts of those who stand before them that the true difference lies, the Greeks, who understood that the sea was a force of nature to be respected but never fully understood, and the Romans, who saw the sea not as something to fear, but something to control. One god's rule over the sea was defined by its wildness, the other, by its mastery. And yet, both Poseidon and Neptune were, in their own way, a reflection of the people who worshipped them. Their seas, like their people, were filled with different truths, truths shaped by the gods, the cultures, and the power that each civilization sought to claim for itself. The battle cries echoed across the battlefield, the clash of metal and the roar of warriors filling the air. Amidst the chaos, one figure stood calm, her eyes focused with an intensity that seemed to cut through the noise around her. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, stood tall, her spear in hand and her shield gleaming, but it wasn't the weapon in her hand that commanded attention, it was the light in her eyes. In her presence, warriors felt the sharp edge of clarity, the understanding that to win was not just about strength, but about the mind. Athena had always been a goddess of intellect as much as she was a goddess of war. The Greeks did not see her as one who was simply tied to the violent frenzy of battle. She was not like Ares, whose very name conjured the brutal, untamed violence of war. No, Athena was different. She was the strategist, the planner. In her wisdom, she saw beyond the bloodshed. She understood that victory was not won by brute force alone, but by knowing when to strike, where to strike, and most importantly, why. Her wisdom wasn't just for generals and soldiers, it was a beacon for anyone seeking knowledge, seeking understanding, a reminder that true strength lay in the mind, as much as in the body. But her wisdom was not separate from her warlike nature. Athena had been born from the head of Zeus, fully grown and armored, a warrior ready to defend both gods and mortals. The Greeks worshipped her as the protector of cities, a guardian of civilization, the embodiment of reason and strategy in the face of chaos. Her intellect was not only about philosophy or the arts, it was about using reason to navigate the challenges of life. Even in war, she understood the importance of planning, of foresight. Athena had been there for heroes like Odysseus, guiding them through trials not only with strength but with cleverness, teaching them that the most important battles are often won not with a sword, but with the mind. Across the seas, in Rome, a different interpretation of the goddess emerged. Minerva, the Roman counterpart to Athena, was still seen as a goddess of wisdom, but her focus was different. While Athena represented a harmonious balance between war and wisdom, Minerva's domain was firmly rooted in the practical, utilitarian application of knowledge. The Romans, ever the pragmatic people, saw Minerva not only as a goddess of intellectual pursuits but as a protector of strategy, craftsmanship, and the arts that served their growing empire. To the Romans, Minerva was not simply a goddess who inspired great minds in philosophy or learning. She was the goddess who guided their warriors in battle and their artisans in creating the tools that built their civilization. Minerva's influence was felt in the Roman military as much as it was in their workshops and schools. She wasn't just a goddess for scholars, she was a goddess for the strategist, the tactician, the planner. The Romans saw their empire not as something to be built through chaos, but through careful, deliberate action. They respected the idea that a battle won by strategy could often be more decisive than one fought by sheer might. In Minerva, they found the wisdom to achieve victory without unnecessary bloodshed, a principle they applied not only to war but to every facet of their society. Athena's wisdom, on the other hand, was far more philosophical. She embodied an idea of wisdom that was intertwined with the very nature of life. It was an intellect that reached beyond mere tactics or strategy. It sought the deeper understanding of the world, of people, of the very forces that shaped existence. Athena guided heroes through moral dilemmas, gave counsel in times of peace and war alike, and shaped the ideas of justice and fairness. Her wisdom was not confined to the battlefield or the workshop. It was universal, a force that could guide the entire city of Athens as much as it could guide an individual hero in their quest. Minerva, while equally revered for her wisdom, was less concerned with the metaphysical. Her wisdom was a tool, one to be wielded in the service of the Roman ideals of strength and practicality. The Romans, in their constant quest for power, saw Minerva's intellect as something to be applied, something that served a clear purpose, whether in war, in the arts, or in governance. Where Athena's wisdom often led to deep introspection, Minerva's wisdom was a blueprint for action. It was the quiet, steady hand that shaped the Roman Empire, guiding decisions that impacted not just the individual but the future of a nation. Their differences in focus reflected the difference between the Greek and Roman worlds. For the Greeks, wisdom was a pursuit of understanding for its own sake. It was an ideal to be honored, a pursuit that transcended the practical needs of daily life. For the Romans, wisdom was meant to serve the empire, to build and sustain a civilization that could stand the test of time. Athena's wisdom was broad and philosophical, while Minerva's wisdom was pointed and strategic. Yet, both were revered for their intellect, their ability to guide people to greatness, whether in battle, in art, or in life itself. But there were times when the essence of both goddesses came together. Both Athena and Minerva understood that wisdom and war were not mutually exclusive. Athena, in her strategy, knew that to win was to understand both the physical and intellectual challenges of war. Minerva, in her craftsmanship, knew that the creation of the tools of war, armor, weapons, was as much an act of intellect as it was an act of labor. Both goddesses represented the harmony between thought and action, the idea that one cannot exist without the other. Their wisdom was not just a gift, it was a responsibility. For those who sought to follow them, it meant that intellect had a higher purpose. Wisdom was not just about knowing the right answers, it was about understanding the consequences of one's choices. Whether in the heat of battle or in the quiet of a workshop, the power of Athena and Minerva lay not in their ability to win wars, but in their ability to guide people to think before they acted, to consider the broader consequences of their decisions. Athena and Minerva, in their distinct ways, represented a higher calling. A call to seek understanding, to use wisdom not for personal gain, but for the greater good. They embodied the idea that true strength lies not just in the body, but in the mind, that the sharpest weapon is often not the sword, but the thought behind it. They were more than goddesses of war, they were the goddesses of the soul, urging their followers to approach life and war with intellect, strategy, and heart. The earth trembled beneath the weight of fury as a storm of war raged across the land. Screams of anguish echoed through the smoke-filled air, the clash of steel against steel relentless. In the heart of this chaos stood a figure, wild, unrestrained, his eyes burning with an insatiable hunger for bloodshed. His presence was intoxicating, an embodiment of the very violence that tore through the world. Ares, the Greek god of war, thrived in the madness, a god whose name was whispered in fear. He was not a god of strategy, nor a protector. Ares was the pure, primal force of war itself. He did not care for honor or cause, he only sought to create destruction. His nature was impulsive, rash, his actions driven by an uncontrollable desire to see the world burn in conflict. He reveled in the battle, the chaos, and the pain, as though war was nothing more than an animalistic thrill. In the midst of battle, Ares stood as a symbol of every ugly emotion that accompanies war, the rage, the bloodlust, the senseless violence. He did not inspire greatness or protect the innocent. Ares was there to witness the agony, the disarray, and the devastation. He thrived in the dissonance, feeding off the misery of all those caught in his path. He was not the god of warriors, he was the god of destruction. The Greeks feared him, not for his ability to lead, but because he was chaos personified. There was no reason in his war. No logic. No mercy. Ares was a violent storm, unpredictable and unforgiving, leaving nothing but brokenness in his wake. Across the Mediterranean, in the rising power of Rome, the perception of war, and the god that represented it, would take a sharp turn. Mars, the Roman counterpart to Ares, stood not as a symbol of mindless violence, but as a beacon of valor, strength, and protection. Mars was not simply the god of war, he was the protector of Rome itself. His name echoed not with fear, but with respect, as the symbol of the Roman ideals, the defender of the Republic, the champion of justice, and the embodiment of Roman military prowess. He was not a god of senseless destruction, but a god who gave warriors the courage to fight for something greater than themselves, the protection of their homes, families, and their very way of life. The contrast between Ares and Mars could not be starker. Where Ares was chaotic and unpredictable, Mars was disciplined, strategic. Ares reveled in the bloodshed and the frenzy, while Mars was the embodiment of honor and duty. Ares was a force that tore down kingdoms, while Mars built them up. To the Romans, Mars was not only the god of war but also of agriculture, reflecting the Roman belief that strength was not just for fighting, but for building, cultivating, and protecting. The Romans believed that war should have a purpose, to protect and to preserve, not to destroy for the sake of destruction. While Ares was seen as a god who could only exist in the darkest corners of humanity's heart, Mars was revered as a symbol of what it meant to fight with purpose. His warriors were not madmen driven by violence, they were soldiers who fought with the righteousness of a cause, whether in the defense of their land or the expansion of their empire. Mars was the god who represented a balance between the harsh realities of war and the noble duty to protect one's people. He was a god that brought order to the chaos, a god who transformed war from a brutal necessity into a disciplined and valorous act. Ares, on the other hand, had no such clarity. He was the god who delighted in war for war's sake. The Greeks recognized this in him, a force that could not be reasoned with, a god whose passion for violence consumed everything it touched. There was no purpose in Ares' battles, no greater good to be found in the carnage. His very existence was a reminder that sometimes, war is not about winning or losing, but about the chaos that takes over when reason disappears. Ares was the god of pure instinct, and as such, he was a god that reflected the darker, more dangerous sides of humanity's nature. His impulsiveness, his thirst for blood, stood in sharp contrast to the discipline that Mars embodied. It is no wonder that the Romans, with their structured society and their quest for stability, saw Mars as the model of what a warrior should be. He was not simply a god of violence, but a god of protection, strength, and unity. The Romans did not seek to glorify the madness of war. They sought to honor those who fought with purpose, those who defended their people and their land with honor, and those who built an empire through strength, not mindless violence. Mars stood as the embodiment of Roman virtue, courage, integrity, and a deep sense of duty. He was revered not just by soldiers, but by all who served the greater good, who understood that war, when necessary, should be fought with restraint and for the right reasons. The discipline of the Roman military, the strategic minds that crafted their victories, all came under the watchful eye of Mars, a god who guided them not just in battle, but in the ideals of what it meant to serve and protect. In contrast, Ares' influence was felt in the darkest hours of war. He represented not protection but destruction, not valor but chaos. He was the god who inspired fear and resentment, a figure whose presence was felt in every senseless act of violence and every battle fought without purpose or end. The Greeks understood the nature of Ares. He was the reminder that war, when unchecked, could devour everything in its path, destroying not just armies but families, cities, and civilizations. Yet, despite their stark differences, both Ares and Mars embodied the eternal truth that war, in its many forms, is an inescapable part of human existence. The way these gods were viewed, however, tells us much about how the cultures of Greece and Rome understood war. For the Greeks, war was a brutal force of nature, something to be feared, something that could not be controlled. For the Romans, war was an instrument, a tool that should be used wisely, carefully, and only when absolutely necessary. Mars, unlike Ares, was not the god who fed on destruction, but the one who protected the future through valor and discipline. In the end, Ares and Mars, and their very natures, revealed the dual faces of war, the mindless destruction that can consume everything, and the disciplined, purposeful force that can protect and build a future. Their stories are reminders that the nature of conflict is both a curse and a calling. There was a time when the world was ruled by love, beauty, and the soft whisper of desire. In the green meadows of the Greek world, a goddess emerged, her presence as intoxicating as the first bloom of spring. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, stood in the center of everything beautiful. Her beauty was so stunning that the earth and heavens themselves seemed to pause in awe. Her laughter was a melody that could make the hardest heart soften, and her gaze could ignite a passion that consumed the soul. The Greeks saw in her an ideal, love that was pure, free, and utterly romantic. She was a symbol of every tender, uncontrollable feeling that gripped the human heart. Whether it was the sweetness of a lover's embrace or the pain of a broken heart, Aphrodite represented the beauty of love in all its forms, even in its most tumultuous. Aphrodite's love was not just about union or beauty, it was the pulse of the world itself. She was the force that brought people together, the quiet whisper in the wind that made hearts race, the scent of roses in the air that reminded you of something sweet and fleeting. She had the power to make even the gods bow down in adoration, to turn the fierce tides of the seas with the stroke of her hand. She was love in its purest form, unpredictable, emotional, and boundless. Aphrodite wasn't just a goddess, she was the very essence of what it meant to desire, to be desired, to experience joy and heartbreak, all in the same breath. But the Romans, practical as they were, would reshape this goddess to fit into their world, a world driven by statecraft, power, and lineage. Venus, the Roman counterpart to Aphrodite, was not just a symbol of romantic love. She became something more. Venus became a pillar of Roman identity, woven into the very fabric of its power. While Aphrodite may have danced in the gardens of Olympus, Venus stood tall in the streets of Rome, her beauty intertwined with the politics of empire, the expansion of territory, and the prestige of bloodlines. She was no longer just the goddess of love, she became the embodiment of Roman virtue, strength, beauty, and fertility, but also the protector of the state and its future. Where Aphrodite's love was often wild and untamed, Venus' role was grounded in the idea of preservation. In the Roman world, love was not just a fleeting emotion, it was something to be harnessed, protected, and carried forward through generations. Venus was the goddess who watched over the unions that produced heirs, the goddess who ensured the continuity of the Roman people. She became not just a figure of beauty, but a symbol of political power. Her beauty was no longer just a thing of aesthetic admiration, but a representation of Rome's imperial might. The Romans used her image to solidify their own importance, claiming her as the ancestor of their greatest rulers, the divine mother of their lineage. Aphrodite's love, ever so soft and enchanting, often led to a complicated world of desires, jealousy, and betrayal. Her myth was full of moments that celebrated the complications of love, her affair with Ares, her marriage to Hephaestus, the golden apple that sparked the Trojan War. Love, for the Greeks, was both a gift and a burden, capable of creating beauty and destruction in equal measure. Aphrodite stood as the perfect symbol of this complexity, the goddess who brought lovers together, yet sometimes set them on paths that would lead to their downfall. But Venus, transformed by Rome, was a goddess of stability. Her love wasn't just passionate, it was controlled, deliberate. It was a love tied to the future of Rome itself, ensuring that the city would continue to grow, thrive, and conquer. Her beauty was still as captivating as Aphrodite's, but it was now married to a sense of duty. She wasn't just the goddess who could make hearts race, she was the goddess who made the heart of Rome beat stronger with every passing year. In her, love and power converged. The Romans sought Venus' blessing not just for personal relationships, but for their entire civilization. The goddess of love was now also the goddess of destiny. As the empire expanded, Venus took on yet another role, that of protector. She was invoked not just in times of love, but in times of war, as the Romans understood that the strength of their people came from the union of hearts and minds, the continuation of their bloodline, and the nurturing of their empire. Venus, with her graceful beauty and powerful influence, was no longer just a goddess of romantic love. She was the mother of Rome's future, the divine force that ensured that the city would endure for generations to come. Aphrodite and Venus both held beauty, love, and allure, but the ways in which they were portrayed reflected the societies that worshipped them. Aphrodite's love was free, spontaneous, and chaotic, with a wild beauty that could be as destructive as it was enchanting. She embodied the raw, untamable emotions that reside in every human heart, the kind of love that could create and destroy in equal measure. Her presence was felt in every tender touch, every stolen kiss, and every heartbreak. Aphrodite was not just a goddess, she was the reflection of the world's most vulnerable, passionate emotions. Venus, in contrast, was love that had been refined, shaped, and wielded for power. She was the love that built an empire, that protected the future, and that ensured Rome's legacy. Her beauty remained captivating, but it was no longer the unpredictable, chaotic force of Aphrodite. Venus' love was tempered with purpose, her power directed at ensuring that the Roman state would thrive, that the gods would bless their rulers, and that the empire would continue to rise. She was the goddess who had mastered love's power, shaping it into something that served the greater good of the empire. Yet, beneath all the differences between the two goddesses, a thread of similarity remained. Both Aphrodite and Venus understood the profound power of love in all its forms. Whether it was the tender, fleeting passion of Aphrodite or the enduring, protective love of Venus, both goddesses reminded their followers of love's potential to create change, to inspire greatness, and to shape the world. Love, in all its beauty, remains an eternal force, timeless and powerful, capable of building empires and breaking hearts. In the shimmering light of dawn, a figure stood, bathed in golden hues that seemed to flow from the heavens themselves. Apollo, the radiant god, was not bound by the constraints of a single culture or people. He belonged to the sunlit expanse of the sky, to the melodies that echoed through ancient lands, and to the hearts of those who sought guidance, healing, and inspiration. His presence was a paradox, a god of clarity and vision, yet enshrouded in the mysteries of prophecy and art. To the Greeks, he was a symbol of balance and harmony, while to the Romans, he became something more, a unifier, a bridge between the divine and the mortal, and an emblem of Rome's enduring strength. The Greeks saw Apollo as a multifaceted deity, his influence stretching across seemingly disparate realms. He was the god of music, whose lyre could stir the soul or soothe the most savage of tempers. His fingers danced across the strings, weaving melodies that spoke of love, loss, and the eternal beauty of the cosmos. Yet, this same Apollo was also the god of prophecy, a seer who could pierce the veil of time and glimpse the threads of fate. At Delphi, his oracle spoke in cryptic verses that shaped the decisions of kings and commoners alike. Apollo's radiance was not just the light of the sun, it was the light of knowledge, of insight, of the relentless pursuit of truth. But Apollo was not merely a god of enlightenment. He carried a bow that shot arrows of plague and destruction, a reminder of the fragility of life and the consequences of human hubris. His wrath, though rare, was devastating. Yet even in his moments of fury, there was a strange kind of justice to his actions, a sense that his punishment was as natural as the rising and setting of the sun. This balance, between creation and destruction, joy and sorrow, defined Apollo in Greek thought. He was not just a god to be worshipped, he was a force to be understood, a reflection of the world's dualities. When the Romans adopted Apollo, they saw in him a figure who could embody their ideals of discipline, order, and unity. While many Greek gods were transformed in the Roman imagination, Apollo remained largely untouched, his identity preserved in its brilliance. The Romans embraced his duality but emphasized his role as a bringer of light, knowledge, and civilization. In the Roman mind, Apollo was not just a god of music and prophecy, he was a protector of the state, a symbol of their cultural and intellectual superiority. His association with the sun became even more prominent, representing the unyielding power of Rome to illuminate the world with its ideals and governance. The variations in Apollo's domains between Greek and Roman mythology reveal the subtle shifts in cultural priorities. For the Greeks, Apollo's connection to music and art reflected their deep appreciation for creativity and expression. His role as a healer and a prophet resonated with their philosophical and spiritual pursuits, their search for meaning in a world of chaos. But for the Romans, Apollo's identity was streamlined, his essence distilled into something more pragmatic. While his artistic and prophetic aspects were not abandoned, they were overshadowed by his role as a guardian of health and a symbol of Rome's invincibility. Temples to Apollo dotted the Roman landscape, testaments to his enduring importance in the empire's spiritual and political life. Yet, through these transitions, the core of Apollo remained the same. He was still the god who brought light to dark places, who inspired poets and guided leaders. He was the god whose voice could be heard in the rustling of leaves at Delphi, in the haunting strains of a lyre, or in the cries of warriors marching into battle. Whether as the Greek Apollo or the Roman Apollo, he embodied a universal truth that light and darkness, joy and sorrow, creation and destruction, are not opposites but parts of a greater whole. Apollo's influence extended beyond temples and myths. He was woven into the fabric of human aspiration. To the Greeks, his music was a reminder of the beauty that could be created even in a world filled with strife. To the Romans, his unwavering light was a symbol of their destiny to rule and bring order to the chaotic corners of the earth. In both cultures, Apollo was not just a god but a guide, a beacon for those who sought to rise above the ordinary and touch the divine. His dual identity is a testament to his timelessness, his ability to transcend cultural boundaries and adapt to the needs of his worshippers. In the graceful movements of a dancer, in the determined steps of a soldier, in the quiet musings of a philosopher, Apollo's presence could be felt. He was the sun that rose every morning, the melody that lingered in the air, the vision that inspired greatness. He was, and remains, a god who speaks to the human condition, a reminder of both our potential and our limitations. In the golden light of Apollo, there is a sense of eternity, a whisper of something greater than ourselves. He is the god who reminds us that in every act of creation, there is a shadow of destruction, and in every moment of despair, there is a glimmer of hope. Apollo's story is not just a tale of gods and mortals, it is a story of humanity, of our struggles to find balance, to seek truth, and to create beauty in a world that is often harsh and unforgiving. Through Apollo, the Greeks and Romans found a way to understand themselves, to see their own fears, hopes, and dreams reflected in the divine. And in doing so, they created a legacy that continues to inspire and awe, as bright and unyielding as the sun itself. The forest was alive, a symphony of whispers carried by the wind through the tall, ancient trees. In the shadows, there was a presence, silent, watchful, untamed. Her bow was poised, her breath steady, her gaze fixed on a flicker of movement ahead. This was Artemis, the Greek goddess of the hunt, her spirit as wild as the forest she roamed. She was the protector of animals, the guardian of the wilderness, and the fierce defender of her independence. Every step she took was both deliberate and free, embodying the paradox of control within boundless freedom. Artemis was not a goddess of compromise. She demanded respect, not through fiery declarations, but through the sheer force of her presence. The moonlight often shone on her face, casting a silvery glow that only heightened the sense of mystery that surrounded her. She represented something primal, something untouchable, the connection between humanity and the raw, unbridled power of nature. She was a goddess of the untamed, the unbroken, the unstoppable. But there was a tenderness to her wildness, too. Artemis protected the vulnerable, children, animals, and those who found themselves at the mercy of others. Her strength was not just in the precision of her arrows, but in the purity of her resolve. She would fight, she would protect, and she would never yield. Her wildness was not reckless, it was deliberate, a statement of her autonomy in a world that so often tried to tame the feral. In the Roman world, she transformed into Diana. The huntress remained, her bow and quiver still symbols of her strength, but there was something new in her bearing, a calm, a focus that spoke to a deeper connection with the order of society. Diana was a protector, yes, but her protection extended beyond the wild animals and forests of her Greek counterpart. She was a guardian of the state, a maternal figure whose nurturing spirit encompassed the Roman people as a whole. Diana was no less fierce, but her ferocity was tempered with a sense of duty. While Artemis stood defiantly outside the bounds of human society, Diana embraced it, weaving her strength into the fabric of Roman life. She was the goddess who watched over women in childbirth, ensuring their safety in moments of profound vulnerability. She was the protector of boundaries, both literal and metaphorical, guarding the lines that held society together. The Greeks saw Artemis as a solitary figure, unyielding in her pursuit of freedom. She was the sister of Apollo, her twin, her equal, yet she existed in her own sphere, untouched by the need for relationships beyond her sacred bond with nature. Her chastity was not a rejection of love, but a declaration of her independence, a refusal to be confined by the roles others might try to impose upon her. Diana, while still embodying the independence of Artemis, was more approachable. She became a goddess of thresholds, of transitions, of moments where the human and divine touched. Her temples were places of sanctuary, where the oppressed could seek refuge and the faithful could find solace. To the Romans, she was a symbol of unity, a reminder that even the wildest forces could be harnessed for the greater good. The wildness of Artemis and the measured strength of Diana revealed two sides of the same coin. Artemis embodied the raw, unfiltered energy of the natural world, a force that could not be contained. She was the howl of the wolf, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the crack of a bowstring in the stillness of the night. Diana, on the other hand, was the cultivated strength of a civilization that sought harmony with the wild rather than dominion over it. She was the moon that guided the lost, the boundary that kept chaos at bay. Both goddesses shared a profound sense of purpose, a commitment to their roles as protectors. But their methods, their domains, their very essence, were shaped by the cultures that revered them. Artemis was a goddess of the untamed spirit, of rebellion against anything that sought to constrain her. Diana was a goddess of integration, of strength that supported and uplifted. And yet, in both, there was an undeniable power that transcended their differences. They were not just huntresses or protectors, they were symbols of resilience, of the enduring strength that lies within those who refuse to be broken. Their arrows struck true, not just in the physical world, but in the hearts of those who looked to them for inspiration. Even now, their stories resonate. In Artemis, there is a reminder of the beauty and strength of independence, of the freedom that comes from living in harmony with one's true nature. In Diana, there is a lesson in balance, and the importance of using strength not just to defend, but to nurture and protect. Both goddesses, in their own ways, embody the complexities of power, love, and duty. In the quiet moments of the night, when the moon casts its pale light over the world, it is easy to feel their presence. Artemis, the wild huntress, moves through the forests, her footsteps light as air, her gaze fierce and unyielding. Diana, the maternal protector, watches over the cities and the fields, her spirit a beacon of hope and safety. They are two faces of the same moon, two sides of the same story, their light shining through the centuries, untamed and eternal. The air grows cold as the ground beneath your feet seems to tremble with an unspoken presence. A shadow, vast and unyielding, envelopes the landscape, yet it is not hostile, it is solemn, resolute. This is the domain of Hades, the Greek lord of the underworld, a figure who carries the weight of all that is final. His eyes, dark and penetrating, do not promise comfort, nor do they revel in terror. They speak only of inevitability. Hades is not a villain in Greek thought, though fear often shrouds his name. He is a figure of order, a guardian of balance in a world that teeters constantly between chaos and harmony. His realm, the underworld, is not a place of arbitrary torment but a domain where the souls of the dead find their destined place. The Elysian fields for the virtuous, the asphodel meadows for the ordinary, and Tartarus for the damned, each soul goes where it belongs. His judgments are unflinching but fair, devoid of malice. In the Greek imagination, death is not merely an end, it is a passage, a transition that mirrors the capriciousness of life. Hades embodies this understanding, not as a punisher but as a custodian of fate. He does not seek to impose morality or reshape human nature, he simply maintains the sanctity of the final threshold. The Romans, however, envisioned a different lord of the underworld. Pluto, though sharing many attributes with Hades, takes on a more encompassing role. While Hades represents the inevitability of death, Pluto embodies the potential that lies beneath. The very name Pluto is derived from the concept of wealth, a nod to the riches hidden deep within the earth, gold, silver, and the fertile soil that sustains life. In Roman thought, the underworld was not just a place of endings, but a source of renewal. Death was part of a larger cycle, a necessary phase in the continuous regeneration of the world. Pluto, unlike the often aloof Hades, was a figure tied more closely to the material and societal aspects of life. His domain extended beyond the shadows and into the wealth of the earth, linking him to prosperity and abundance as much as to the inevitability of mortality. The stark difference in their portrayals reflects the values and fears of the cultures that shaped them. Hades, distant and enigmatic, mirrors the Greek acceptance of life's unpredictability. He is neither cruel nor kind, simply unyielding. Pluto, on the other hand, is a testament to Roman practicality and ambition, a god who bridges the divide between death and the promise of prosperity. Hades' presence is felt in the myths of Orpheus and Eurydice, where love and loss intertwine in heart-wrenching tragedy. Orpheus' descent into the underworld to reclaim his beloved from death is not met with rage or cruelty from Hades, but with a rare and conditional compassion. The stipulation that Orpheus not look back until they are free of the underworld speaks to the weight of trust and consequence in Hades' realm. When Orpheus falters, it is not Hades who punishes him but the inexorable laws of fate itself. Pluto's influence, by contrast, is seen in tales of expansion and legacy. In Roman mythology, his union with Proserpina, the Roman counterpart to Persephone, symbolizes the inextricable link between death and the renewal of life. Proserpina's seasonal descent into the underworld brings winter, while her return heralds spring. The Romans saw in Pluto a god who could be both the harbinger of death and the custodian of life's cyclical abundance. The moral implications of these figures differ as well. Hades is a god of endings, and his mythology often serves as a reminder of life's fleeting nature. His detachment suggests that morality is a human construct, something to be grappled with in life rather than adjudicated in death. In contrast, Pluto's connection to wealth and prosperity ties him to societal values. He represents not just the end, but the enduring impact of one's actions, how life's efforts might echo beyond death in legacy and influence. In both gods, there is a sense of inevitability, but the emotions they evoke are distinct. Hades inspires a somber acceptance, a reflection on the fragility of existence. His underworld is a place of finality, where the soul finds its place according to its deeds and nature. Pluto, however, suggests a more dynamic relationship with death, one that includes the potential for growth, transformation, and the continuation of a cycle that benefits the living. Standing before the gates of their realms, one might feel different shades of awe. Hades' gate, guarded by Cerberus, is foreboding yet impartial. To enter is to face the culmination of life's choices and to accept what comes after. Pluto's gate, though equally solemn, carries an air of promise. To enter is to acknowledge the unseen connections between death, wealth, and the fertile ground that sustains the future. Both Hades and Pluto command respect, not just for their power but for the profound truths they represent. They are not tyrants of the underworld but stewards of its mysteries. Through them, the Greeks and Romans sought to understand the unknown, to make peace with mortality, and to find meaning in the inexorable march of time. As shadows deepen and the air grows still, one can almost hear their voices, not loud, not demanding, but resolute. Hades speaks of endings that cannot be avoided, of the stillness that comes when all is done. Pluto speaks of the treasures buried in that stillness, of the seeds waiting to sprout in the darkness. Both remind us that death, like life, is complex, layered, and deeply intertwined with everything that comes before and after. A soft breeze rustles the leaves, carrying whispers of stories older than the stars. Each whisper carries a name: Hermes, Mercury, Hephaestus, Vulcan, Demeter, Ceres, and the echoes of their deeds ripple through the vast tapestry of time. These gods, often standing in the shadows of their more celebrated kin, hold tales of subtle power and profound influence, their stories laced with moments that shape the world in ways both quiet and magnificent. Hermes stands on a threshold, one foot in the mortal world, the other in the divine. He is the messenger, a guide, and a trickster, his laughter as light as a feather yet as sharp as a blade. His sandals, winged and swift, skim the earth, carrying messages between gods and mortals, threading worlds together with threads of fate. There's a glint in his eye, a mischievous promise of chaos and ingenuity. He's the god of travelers and thieves, of commerce and cunning, a spirit untamed, forever in motion. Mercury echoes Hermes but carries the weight of Roman practicality. While Hermes plays, Mercury strategizes. He moves through markets and battlefields with the same ease, embodying the Roman ideals of efficiency and resourcefulness. The laughter remains, but it is tempered, shaped into something more deliberate. Mercury whispers not of tricks but of opportunities, his hand guiding the flow of trade, wealth, and influence. If Hermes is a songbird, Mercury is the steady hum of a city at work, constant, industrious, and sharp. Then there's Hephaestus, the master of fire and forge. His hands are scarred, his back bent slightly from hours spent at the anvil. The sparks fly as he creates weapons fit for gods and wonders that defy imagination. Yet behind the strength lies vulnerability. Hephaestus, the outcast, knows pain and rejection, and in that pain, he finds a wellspring of creativity. Each hammer's strike is a heartbeat, each creation a testament to endurance. Vulcan, his Roman counterpart, bears the same fire but wields it differently. Where Hephaestus channels his pain into beauty, Vulcan's fire smolders with the power of destruction and renewal. The Romans saw him as both a craftsman and a protector, his flames forging not only tools and weapons but also the bonds of the state. His temples stood as reminders of fire's dual nature, its ability to build and to destroy, to warm and to consume. Demeter walks through fields of golden wheat, her touch bringing life to the earth. Her gaze, filled with love and sorrow, lingers on the cycles of planting and harvest, of growth and decay. She is the mother who nurtures and mourns, her heart forever tied to Persephone, who dances between light and shadow. Every blade of grass, every ear of corn, sings of her care. Ceres, the Roman embodiment of Demeter, holds the same power but with a sharper edge. She is not just the nurturer but the protector of the state's lifeblood, its agriculture. Ceres is law and order, a figure of discipline as much as of bounty. Her festivals, solemn and grand, celebrate not just the earth's abundance but the civic harmony it ensures. She stands as a reminder that the earth's gifts are both a blessing and a responsibility. And then, there are the countless others, their stories weaving together like stars forming constellations. Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and ecstasy, embodies chaos and liberation. His wild dances under the moonlight break barriers and blur lines. His Roman counterpart, Bacchus, mirrors the same revelry but channels it into discipline, his frenzies structured into festivals that strengthen community bonds. Ares, with his wild, impulsive thirst for battle, clashes against Mars, the Roman god of war, whose strength is tempered by strategy and a sense of duty. Athena, wise and resolute, finds her Roman reflection in Minerva, whose wisdom is sharpened for governance and statecraft. Artemis, untamed and wild, stands beside Diana, whose gaze turns toward the city and the hearth, softening her wilderness with maternal care. Each god, each story, carries a thread of human experience. The Greeks, with their passion for individuality and complexity, painted their gods as flawed and relatable, their struggles echoing human frailty and resilience. The Romans, pragmatic and state-oriented, reshaped these divine figures into symbols of collective strength and unity, their flaws softened by the demands of order. These gods, less sung but no less significant, remind us of the countless facets of existence, the balance of chaos and order, the interplay of vulnerability and strength, the connection between the individual and the collective. Their voices, though quieter, resonate deeply, their stories a mirror to the complexities of life. And as their names are whispered once more, the air hums with their presence, reminding us of the threads that tie the mortal and the divine, the past and the present. A lone figure stands beneath a vast, starry sky, his breath visible in the cold air. The weight of the world presses on his shoulders, yet his gaze remains fixed on the horizon. He knows what lies ahead, monsters with scales that glint like blades, trials that gnaw at the soul, and choices that blur the lines between right and wrong. But this is the life of a hero. Not one born from perfection, but one carved out of struggle, mistakes, and a relentless will to rise, again and again. Heracles, the strongest of them all, is not just a man of muscle but a man of sorrow. His name might echo with glory, but his life is marked by torment. Driven to madness by Hera's unyielding wrath, he commits an unspeakable act, one that shatters his soul. To atone, he faces the impossible, 12 labors, each more grueling than the last. As he battles the Nemean lion, wrestles the many-headed Hydra, and carries the weight of the heavens, the world sees his strength. But it's in his quiet moments, when the blood has dried and the crowd has dispersed, that the man beneath the hero emerges. Heracles' true power isn't in his might but in his endurance. He carries his guilt and grief, not as a burden but as a reminder of what it means to be human. Perseus, with his polished shield and sharp blade, begins his tale with uncertainty. Born of divine lineage yet thrust into a world of mortal danger, his path is not chosen but forced upon him. The Gorgon Medusa, with her gaze that turns flesh to stone, becomes his trial. The fear he feels is visceral, but it's matched by his resourcefulness. Armed with gifts from the gods, Athena's shield, Hermes' winged sandals, he doesn't charge blindly into battle. Instead, he reflects, strategizes, and uses his wits. Perseus' triumph over Medusa isn't just a victory over a monster, it's a testament to the power of courage tempered with thought. Yet his story, like all heroes, isn't spotless. Even his successes carry shadows, reminding us that victory often comes at a price. And then there is Odysseus, the man of twists and turns. His name conjures images of the open sea, endless waves stretching toward unknown lands. But his journey is not one of conquest, it's one of return. The Trojan War leaves him weary, but the call of home is unrelenting. Yet, the gods, with their whims and rivalries, twist his path into a labyrinth. He faces the Cyclops, whose single eye burns with rage, the Sirens, whose songs promise pleasure and doom, and the wrath of Poseidon, whose storms test his resolve. Odysseus is cunning, his mind is sharp as any blade. He lies, deceives, and outwits his enemies, not out of malice, but survival. His story is not one of perfection, it's a reflection of life's unpredictability, where even the most steadfast are swayed by temptation and doubt. These heroes, though exalted, are achingly human. They bleed, they falter, and they wrestle with choices that would break lesser souls. Heracles' labors are not just feats of strength, but acts of redemption. Perseus' triumphs reveal that the greatest battles are fought with both heart and mind. Odysseus, for all his cunning, reminds us that the hardest journey isn't the one across oceans, but the one back to ourselves. Yet, their flaws do not diminish them, they define them. Heracles' rage, Perseus' hesitations, and Odysseus' hubris make their victories all the more poignant. For every monster they slay, there is an inner demon lurking, and their true heroism lies in confronting both. They are not gods, though they brush shoulders with divinity. They are men, bound by mortal struggles but elevated by their refusal to yield. In their tales, there's a spark of something eternal, a reminder that greatness is not born of perfection but of persistence. That a hero is not someone who never falls, but someone who rises, scarred and wiser, to face the next storm. And as their stories echo across time, they whisper a truth to all who listen, that within every heart lies the seed of a hero, waiting for the call. The forest was alive with whispers. Leaves rustled without wind, shadows shifted without warning, and the air carried a strange, almost melodic tension. It was the kind of place where every step seemed to awaken unseen eyes. From behind a cluster of ancient oaks, a figure emerged, half man, half horse. His torso gleamed under the pale moonlight, strong and human, but his lower half was wild and untamed, hooves stamping impatiently against the earth. A centaur, his presence both majestic and unsettling, stood as a bridge between the human and the wild, a creature caught between two worlds. Centaurs are not mere beings, they are the embodiment of conflict. They represent the struggle between civility and savagery, intellect and instinct. Among the Greeks, they often charged into myths as uncontrollable, their stories laced with chaos and violence. Yet, in their midst was Chiron, a paradox of his kind, wise, gentle, a healer and teacher. He taught heroes like Achilles and Asclepius, showing that even in the most tumultuous hearts, wisdom could take root. The Greeks saw in centaurs a reflection of humanity itself, flawed and conflicted, but with the potential for greatness. Roman myths absorbed the centaur but cast them in a softer light. They became less a symbol of chaos and more a reminder of balance. Where the Greeks leaned into their wildness, the Romans saw opportunity, a way to emphasize the harmony between nature and order. It was as if the centaur's very duality echoed Rome's constant effort to tame and incorporate the world around it. Not far from the centaur's forest, laughter echoed. Satyrs, mischievous, goat-legged revelers, danced beneath the stars. With their shaggy legs and pointed ears, they radiated joy that bordered on madness, a carefree abandon that often tipped into danger. To the Greeks, satyrs were the companions of Dionysus, embodiments of excess and indulgence. They drank, they danced, and they crossed lines with reckless glee. Their presence in stories was a reminder of the thin line between celebration and destruction. The Romans took this wild spirit and tempered it. Fauns, their version of satyrs, kept the mischief but carried a gentler, more pastoral grace. Fauns weren't just about drunken revelry, they were guardians of the woods, protectors of flocks, and symbols of rustic simplicity. In them, Rome found a way to ground the wildness of the satyr in the steadiness of the earth. They stood as a testament to a different kind of balance, one that celebrated joy without forsaking responsibility. Then there were the creatures that whispered only through Roman myths. The Manes, ancestral spirits, flickered like candle flames in the minds of the living. They were neither monsters nor gods, but guardians of lineage, protectors of the hearth and home. To honor them was to honor the roots of existence, the ties that bound families through time. These spirits weren't wild or menacing, they were deeply personal, woven into the daily lives of Roman families, their roles heavy with quiet, steadfast significance. Among the unique Roman creatures, the Caladrius stood out, a bird of pure white, its feathers almost glowing with an otherworldly sheen. It wasn't just a symbol of beauty but of healing and hope. The Romans believed that if the Caladrius looked upon a sick person, their illness would vanish, absorbed by the bird. If it turned away, however, the prognosis was grim. This creature wasn't just a healer, it was a reflection of fate itself, of life's merciless, unpredictable turns. And what of the Greek chimera? A grotesque fusion of lion, goat, and serpent, its very existence seemed a defiance of natural law. Fire roared from its lion's mouth, while its goat's head bleated in eerie discord. It was not merely a monster but a symbol of chaos, a warning of the dangers lurking when the world's order was broken. The Greeks viewed it as a challenge, a beast that demanded courage, intellect, and strength to overcome. The Romans borrowed the chimera but imbued it with practicality. They saw it as more than a chaotic threat, it became a lesson in unity. By facing a creature of such mismatched parts, heroes symbolically confronted the fragmented challenges of life, proving that harmony could be forged even from discord. Each mythical creature, whether shared or unique, carried more than a story, it carried a heartbeat, a glimpse into the fears, dreams, and values of the people who gave them life. The Greeks and Romans didn't just populate their worlds with monsters and marvels for entertainment, they did so to make sense of existence. To see a centaur galloping through the forest was to feel the tug-of-war between wild instincts and human reason. To hear the laughter of a satyr, or the softer echoes of a faun, was to confront the dual nature of joy, both liberating and perilous. Even in their wildest forms, these creatures were reflections of humanity. The Greeks painted them in vivid strokes of passion and chaos, raw and unrestrained. The Romans, ever practical, reshaped their edges, finding meaning in their structure, weaving them into the very fabric of their culture. Together, these creatures didn't just inhabit myths, they inhabited hearts, whispering truths that transcended time. The sound of footsteps, soft and frantic, echoed through the woods. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart beat a frantic drum against her chest. Daphne ran, the whisper of Apollo's pursuit trailing close behind her. The sun god's golden voice called her name, a melody that promised devotion yet carried the weight of obsession. She didn't stop to answer. She didn't dare. Ahead, the forest seemed endless, but her strength was waning. A silent prayer escaped her lips, not for escape but for transformation, for anything that could sever her from this relentless chase. And then, the air shifted. Her legs, trembling with exhaustion, stiffened as her feet took root. Her arms lifted skyward, stretching as though reaching for salvation, even as they hardened into bark. Leaves sprouted where her fingers had been, and the warmth of her human form was replaced by the cool stillness of a laurel tree. Daphne's breathless fear gave way to silence, her transformation not just a salvation but a stark and eternal reminder of her plea. This tale, one of many in Greek mythology, is a portrait of change, both beautiful and tragic. The Greeks told stories of metamorphosis with raw emotion, each transformation a reflection of struggle, punishment, or desperate escape. The gods wielded power over the mortal form, often reshaping it to suit their whims or to convey a lesson. Transformation wasn't merely physical, it was deeply symbolic, a way of externalizing the human condition. Narcissus, gazing at his reflection in a still pool, is another soul caught in the throes of change. His beauty was unmatched, but his heart, cold and self-absorbed, knew no love for others. As he stared at his mirrored image, he fell into a love so consuming that it chained him to his own visage. The moment stretched into days, and the days into eternity. Slowly, his mortal form withered, and in its place bloomed a delicate flower, a narcissus, its petals forever bowing toward the water, caught in a silent, unending reflection. Ovid, the Roman poet, wove metamorphoses into his verses with a masterful touch, layering them with emotion, drama, and humanity. His stories didn't just recount the transformations but infused them with a timeless depth. Pygmalion's ivory statue, for instance, was no mere work of art. It was his heart carved into form, his devotion and longing made tangible. When Venus breathed life into the statue, the cold ivory warmed into flesh, and Pygmalion's silent love found a voice. It was a transformation born of love, one that underscored the Roman appreciation for beauty, devotion, and the divine hand in mortal affairs. But not all transformations carried such warmth. In Ovid's retelling of Arachne's tale, the loom became a battlefield. Arachne, a mortal, dared to challenge Minerva, the goddess of wisdom and craft. Her tapestry, flawless and bold, depicted the gods' misdeeds with biting clarity. Her skill was undeniable, her defiance unforgettable. Minerva, though awed, could not accept the insult. In a moment of wrath, she transformed Arachne into a spider, her weaving hands cursed to spin webs for eternity. It was a punishment that resonated deeply, a reflection of the cost of pride and the gods' unyielding authority. The Greeks and Romans saw transformation as both punishment and gift, a force that revealed the truths of life. To be changed was to be redefined, to carry forward a story that transcended mortal existence. Ovid's Metamorphoses captured this essence, spinning tales that were at once poetic and visceral. His transformations weren't just physical, they reached into the soul, reshaping identity, memory, and destiny. Each tale of change carried its own rhythm, its own heartbeat. The stories pulsed with emotions as raw as Daphne's terror or as tender as Pygmalion's love. The transformations often blurred the line between victim and victor, between blessing and curse. A beautiful boy turned flower, a defiant girl turned tree, a proud weaver turned spider, each left behind a legacy etched into the natural world, their forms immortalized in blossoms, branches, and threads. In these myths, the act of transformation wasn't just an end but a beginning. The new forms were a testament to resilience, to the idea that even in the face of divine will, mortals could endure. Daphne's tree stood tall, her leaves crowning victors in ceremonies that honored her strength. Narcissus' flower remained a delicate reminder of the dangers of self-obsession. Arachne's webs, intricate and strong, became symbols of both creativity and caution. These stories, whether told by Greek poets or woven into Ovid's verses, resonated because they touched on the universal. They were not just about gods and mortals, they were about the inevitability of change, the power of transformation, and the ways in which life, no matter how fractured or fleeting, could leave an indelible mark. A thread dangled from the spindle, delicate and deceptively fragile. Its silken length swayed in the still air, as though aware of the ancient hands that worked it. The first pair, firm yet unhurried, spun the thread into existence, pulling it from the unknown. The second set of hands stretched and measured it, their touch deliberate and unyielding. The final pair, steady and merciless, held the scissors. Their blades gleamed coldly, waiting for the moment to sever. This was the fabric of life itself, spun, measured, and cut by the Moirai, the Greek goddesses of fate. Their names, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, carried the weight of inevitability. Clotho wove the thread, giving form to each life. Lachesis measured it, determining its length and what it would hold. Atropos ended it, cutting it without hesitation. To the Greeks, these three figures stood above gods and mortals alike. Zeus himself could not intervene once the scissors closed. The Moirai were not cruel, they were truth embodied. Their work was the rhythm of existence, impartial and immutable. But fate is never just an abstract idea, it pulses through stories, each thread tightening around those who try to escape it. Oedipus, a king doomed by prophecy, lived under the shadow of fate's decree. His parents had tried to outrun it, abandoning him to die as an infant. Yet, the thread spun by Clotho led him back to his birthplace. The choices he made, born of ignorance and fear, aligned perfectly with the path Lachesis measured. When Atropos cut his thread, it was tangled with murder and heartbreak, his tragedy not just his own but woven into the tapestry of his lineage. The Romans, too, feared and revered the fates, known as the Parsi. Nona, Decima, and Morta carried out their solemn duty with precision. While they bore similarities to the Greek Moirai, their presence in Roman life carried a different undertone. To the Romans, the fates worked closely with the state, their threads intertwined with the destiny of Rome itself. They symbolized stability and continuity, their work ensuring the empire's endurance as much as that of any individual. Fate in Roman thought was often tied to the concept of destiny, fatum, a divine plan guiding not just individuals but the collective. Aeneas, the Trojan hero whose journey laid the foundation for Rome, walked a path defined by prophecy. The gods themselves moved to ensure he fulfilled his role. The will of the fates became the will of Rome, their threads guiding not just lives, but the birth of empires. Yet the difference between Greek and Roman views of fate wasn't just in their scope, but in their emotional resonance. For the Greeks, fate was deeply personal, often a tragic inevitability that could neither be fought nor understood. Achilles, knowing his thread was short, lived with fiery intensity. His death was certain, prophesied before he was old enough to grasp its meaning. But it was not just his end that was fated, it was the manner of it, the shape his choices would take as they led him to his final breath. His fate wasn't simply a line drawn in stone, but a series of moments, each inescapably his own. The Romans embraced fate with a stoic practicality. Destiny was not a tragedy to mourn, but a duty to fulfill. Heroes like Aeneas carried their burdens with a sense of purpose. When the fates dictated that he abandon Dido, the queen who loved him, he did so with anguish, but without question. His tears did not stop him, for his thread was bound to a greater vision, the founding of Rome. For the Romans, submission to fate was an act of strength, a testament to their values of discipline and loyalty. In both traditions, prophecy acted as fate's voice, a whisper of what was to come. Oracles spoke words that echoed through the ages, cryptic and haunting. The Oracle of Delphi, seated upon her tripod, inhaling sacred vapors, delivered messages that could shape kingdoms. Her prophecies often felt like riddles, their meanings clear only in hindsight. "You will kill your father and marry your mother," she told Oedipus, her words shaping his every step. The Greeks saw prophecy as a warning, a glimpse into a future already written yet painfully out of reach. The Romans, ever practical, treated prophecy as guidance. The Sibylline books, sacred texts of prophecy, were consulted in times of crisis. Unlike the Greek oracles, whose visions often brought despair, the Romans used their prophecies to find solutions, to align themselves with fate's plan rather than fight against it. When Hannibal threatened Rome, it was prophecy that guided their response, offering not just insight but strategy. And yet, for all the differences, one truth bound the Greeks and Romans: fate was unyielding. To try to escape it was to tighten its grip, to resist its pull was to feel it more keenly. Whether personal or collective, whether woven into a single life or the fabric of an empire, fate was the thread that connected all things. Even as the fates worked silently, their presence was felt in every choice, every moment. The thread could be frayed, tangled, or stretched, but never broken. It was a humbling reminder of life's fragility and its purpose, a force both terrifying and strangely comforting. For in the hands of the fates, there was no chaos, only the steady rhythm of the spindle, the measure, and the cut. A lone figure stood at the edge of a cliff, arms stretched wide against the roaring wind. Below him, the sea churned in restless fury, waves clawing at the rocks with relentless hunger. His heart swelled with defiance, his voice carrying over the abyss as he cried out to the heavens, challenging the gods themselves. Prometheus, the titan who dared to steal fire, had not knelt. He had not cowered. And for his audacity, he paid with eternal torment. The Greeks did not shy away from the darkness of ambition. Their myths were filled with heroes and mortals who reached too far, blinded by their desires. The word for it was hubris, the arrogance that tempted mortals to believe they could rival the divine. It was not just a sin, it was a warning. Icarus, soaring too close to the sun with wings of wax, felt the searing kiss of his folly as he plummeted to the earth. Oedipus, striving to outmaneuver fate, found himself ensnared in its unrelenting grasp. Hubris was not punished out of spite, but as a reminder of balance, a delicate harmony that could shatter with the weight of excess. To the Greeks, morality was not a rigid code but a pursuit of balance. The gods themselves, with their tempers and passions, were a reflection of this struggle. Zeus, the king of the gods, wielded his thunderbolt against those who upset the cosmic order. Yet even Zeus was not above temptation, his desires leading him into conflicts that tested the very balance he sought to maintain. Morality, in the Greek sense, was less about rules and more about harmony, a dance between ambition and restraint, power and humility. The tale of Narcissus echoed this pursuit. His beauty was unrivaled, yet it consumed him. Enraptured by his reflection, he wasted away, unable to pull himself from the surface of the pool. The lesson was clear: self-obsession, unchecked, could destroy. Balance was the ideal, the golden mean between pride and humility, love for oneself and care for others. If the Greeks sought balance, the Romans sought virtue. Their word for it was pietas, a sense of duty that extended to family, the gods, and the state. It was not merely an ideal, it was a way of life. Aeneas, the Trojan hero, embodied pietas in every step he took. When Troy fell and his world turned to ash, he did not falter. He carried his father on his back, led his son by the hand, and bore the weight of his people's future. His choices were not easy, his sacrifices not small, but his sense of duty never wavered. Roman morality was rooted in action, in the tangible expression of values. It was not enough to feel loyalty or reverence, one had to live it. Aeneas' departure from Dido, the queen who loved him, was a painful testament to this. He left not out of desire but necessity, bound by a duty that transcended personal happiness. To the Romans, this was the height of virtue, to place the greater good above the self. The gods of Rome mirrored these values. Jupiter, their counterpart to Zeus, was less tempestuous, more measured. He was a guardian of order and justice, a reflection of the Roman ideal of discipline. Juno, often portrayed as vengeful in Greek myths, became a protector of the state, her wrath tempered by her role as a mother figure to Rome. The Roman pantheon, though drawn from Greek roots, was reshaped to align with their ethical framework, their gods less impulsive and more emblematic of societal values. Yet Roman myths were not without their tragedies. The tale of Lucretia, a noblewoman whose virtue and honor were shattered by violence, ignited a revolution. Her death was not in vain, it became a rallying cry, a symbol of the fight against tyranny. In her story, morality was not just a personal pursuit but a collective responsibility. Her sacrifice was a stark reminder of the cost of virtue and the weight of duty. The Greeks, with their emphasis on individual balance, and the Romans, with their focus on collective virtue, both saw morality as a foundation of existence. But their approaches were as different as the myths they told. Where the Greeks wove cautionary tales, the Romans built blueprints for action. Both, however, recognized the complexity of human nature, the pull of ambition, the need for restraint, the struggle to honor oneself and others. Their myths endured because they spoke to this struggle, to the universal challenge of being human. Prometheus chained to a rock, Aeneas standing on the shores of Italy, Icarus falling from the heavens, these were not just characters but reflections of us all. Their stories, like threads in a tapestry, wove together the essence of morality, a pattern both timeless and deeply human. The marble glowed in the soft light of dawn, cool to the touch and ancient beyond measure. A faint echo hung in the air, the whispers of prayers offered centuries ago. It was not just stone, it was a threshold, a place where mortal footsteps hesitated, unsure if they intruded upon something divine. In Greece, the temples were more than structures. They were homes, sacred abodes for gods who walked among mortals in spirit. Each column, each carved relief, bore witness to the human longing to reach beyond the stars and touch the eternal. The Temple of Athena in Athens stood proud atop the Acropolis, its silhouette a constant reminder of the goddess it housed. Within its walls, there were no congregations, no throngs of worshippers gathered for collective rituals. Instead, it was quiet, reverent, a space where Athena herself was thought to reside. Offerings were placed with trembling hands, the scent of burning incense wafting into the air. The Greeks built these temples for the gods, not the people. They were places of presence, not assembly. A single statue, carved with meticulous care, represented the deity, its eyes seeming to watch, its expression both serene and formidable. Standing before Zeus's temple at Olympia, one could feel the weight of power. The statue of Zeus within, crafted by the genius of Phidias, towered over all, a testament to the ruler of gods. It wasn't just art, it was an encounter. Pilgrims came not to gather, but to pay homage, to seek favor or forgiveness in the silent communion of their hearts. The Greeks understood that the divine could not be contained by walls, yet they built these structures as bridges, points of contact between mortal frailty and immortal strength. In Rome, the temples spoke a different language. They were not only sacred but social, not only homes for the gods but hearths for the community. At the heart of every Roman city stood a temple, its steps bustling with life. Children laughed, merchants argued, and elders spoke in hushed tones about the affairs of the state. The gods were there, but so were the people. The Pantheon's massive dome was a marvel of engineering, its oculus a direct gaze into the heavens. This was a temple for all gods, a place where Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and more could coexist. Yet it wasn't shrouded in solemnity. It welcomed crowds, became a gathering place for rituals that blended the sacred with the celebratory. Offerings were still made, prayers still whispered, but the temple was alive with the rhythm of the city, a pulse that echoed the collective heartbeat of Rome. Vesta's temple, a circular sanctuary glowing with an eternal flame, symbolized Rome's undying spirit. The Vestal Virgins, keepers of the fire, ensured that it never faltered. People passed by daily, nodding in respect, reminded of their shared identity and the protective presence of Vesta. The temple was small, simple, yet its significance loomed large over the city. It was not just for the goddess, it was for the people, a place where the divine promise of Rome's endurance was kept alive. Even in the sprawling forum, where Jupiter's grand temple dominated the skyline, the gods were woven into the fabric of human activity. State decisions, public ceremonies, and communal celebrations revolved around these sacred spaces. Unlike the secluded sanctuaries of Greece, Roman temples thrived as centers of convergence, where the divine and mundane intertwined seamlessly. Yet, even within their differences, there was a shared reverence. In both Greece and Rome, the act of stepping into a temple was stepping out of the ordinary. The air changed, time slowed. Whether in the quiet, godly homes of Greece or the vibrant, communal spaces of Rome, temples were thresholds to something greater. They were places where humanity reached upward, not to grasp, but to give, to honor, and to remember its place in the vast, mysterious cosmos. The morning light barely touched the horizon, yet the village square was alive with movement. Women carried baskets of offerings, their hands trembling as they arranged fruits, honey, and the occasional precious trinket onto woven mats. The priests, their robes stark against the soft glow of the fire, chanted prayers in a rhythm older than memory. There was no laughter, no casual chatter, only the low murmur of reverence, the rustle of garments, and the crackle of flames. The Greeks didn't take rituals lightly. Each act, every word, carried the weight of appeasement, a fragile thread connecting mortals to the gods who ruled above. The air was heavy with incense as the heifer was led forward, its wide, dark eyes reflecting the golden hue of the sunrise. The crowd held its breath, children peeking from behind their mothers' skirts. This was not cruelty, it was necessity. To spill the blood of an innocent creature was to communicate with forces beyond understanding, to plead for mercy, guidance, or protection. The Greeks believed their gods were temperamental, quick to anger and slow to forgive. Rituals were shields, a way to keep the divine wrath at bay. At Delphi, the Pythian Games were held in Apollo's honor. There were competitions, yes, but they were wrapped in sacredness. Before athletes tested their strength and speed, sacrifices were made to Apollo. Musicians played haunting hymns, their melodies weaving through the stone amphitheater like whispers from another world. The Greeks understood that their offerings were not mere displays, they were lifelines, ensuring harmony between humanity and the capricious gods. In stark contrast, the Roman festivals painted a different picture. The streets of Rome, once bustling with merchants and chatter, would transform into avenues of unity and celebration. The Saturnalia, for instance, flipped the city on its head. Masters served slaves, children traded small gifts, and laughter echoed through every alley. Saturn was honored, yes, but the heart of the festival was the people. It wasn't only about honoring the gods, it was about strengthening the bonds between citizens, reminding them of their shared destiny under Rome's eternal banner. During the festival of Lupercalia, priests clad in goatskins ran through the streets, playfully striking onlookers with strips of leather. This act, bizarre as it seemed, was a blessing for fertility and purification. Women reached out their hands eagerly, hoping for a touch that might bring a child into their arms or good fortune into their lives. It was chaotic and loud, but it was Roman to its core, an intricate weave of religion, community, and life. The Vestalia, a quieter affair, centered on the goddess Vesta. Women, especially matrons, visited her temple barefoot, carrying offerings of grain. The temple doors, closed most of the year, were opened, revealing the sacred hearth. The simplicity of the act, a woman kneeling to present her grain, carried immense weight. Vesta wasn't just a goddess, she was home, family, and the unyielding spirit of Rome. Where the Greeks feared their gods, the Romans treated theirs as partners in civic life. Religion was inseparable from politics, woven into every law, celebration, and ceremony. Triumphs were marked by grand processions to Jupiter's temple, where victorious generals offered thanks and shared their spoils. The gods were present not only in moments of personal reverence, but in the heartbeat of Rome itself. But even amid the grandeur, there was tenderness. In both cultures, rituals were moments of connection. A Greek farmer kneeling by his field, pouring wine into the soil, might have whispered words to Demeter, begging for a bountiful harvest. A Roman mother lighting a small candle before an image of Juno might have prayed for her child's health. These acts, small yet profound, were bridges between the seen and the unseen. Through every chant, every offering, and every celebration, the threads of human existence intertwined with the divine. Whether in solemnity or joy, whether in the quiet groves of Greece or the bustling streets of Rome, rituals carried the essence of what it meant to be alive, fragile, hopeful, and forever reaching for the eternal. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the faint rustle of olive branches swaying in the evening breeze. Shadows danced on the sacred path as initiates, cloaked in secrecy and anticipation, approached the hallowed sanctuary of Demeter and Persephone. They carried torches that cast flickering light across their faces, their expressions a mixture of awe and quiet resolve. The Eleusinian mysteries were not for the curious or the faint-hearted. This was a passage into the unknown, a ritual that promised enlightenment but demanded absolute faith. No one who participated in these rites ever spoke of what transpired. There were whispers, of course, fragments of tales that trickled down through the ages. Some said the initiates were shown visions of the gods. Others spoke of a sacred drink, Kykeon, that opened their minds to truths beyond mortal comprehension. What was certain, however, was the transformation. Those who emerged from the mysteries were never the same. They carried with them a serene understanding, a quiet strength, as though they had glimpsed the eternal rhythm of life and death. The Greeks held these mysteries close, guarding them against the prying eyes of the profane. To stand within that sacred space was to confront the great unknown, to face the cycles of harvest and decay, loss and renewal. In Demeter's grief and Persephone's return, the initiates saw reflections of their own mortality, their own hopes for rebirth. It was not merely a ritual, it was a lifeline, a thread of hope tethering humanity to the divine. Centuries later, Rome inherited this legacy. But as with all things Roman, the mysteries took on new shapes, new meanings. The Romans were pragmatic, their world one of conquest and order, yet they too sought the profound. Mystery cults from across the empire, Egyptian, Persian, Greek, found fertile ground in the heart of Rome. They wove themselves into the fabric of Roman life, offering solace to those who sought something deeper, something more personal than the grandeur of state religion. One of the most enigmatic of these cults was that of Isis. Her worship, with roots in Egypt, crossed the Mediterranean and flourished in Rome. Her devotees gathered in secret, chanting prayers that invoked her power as a healer, a mother, a savior. The rituals were intricate, involving purification, initiation, and a symbolic death and rebirth. To follow Isis was to place one's faith in a goddess who transcended borders, a divine presence that promised protection in this life and the next. Then there was Mithras, the soldier's god, whose cult spread like wildfire through the ranks of the Roman legions. His mysteries were conducted in underground temples, where initiates reenacted the slaying of the sacred bull, a potent symbol of cosmic renewal. The dim light of oil lamps cast long shadows on the walls as men swore oaths of loyalty, their voices echoing in the confined space. In the Mithraic mysteries, they found brotherhood, strength, and a connection to forces beyond their understanding. What made these mystery religions so powerful was their intimacy. Unlike the grand spectacles of public worship, these rites were deeply personal. They spoke to the fears and hopes that lived in the quiet corners of the human heart. They promised more than the favor of the gods, they offered meaning. To be initiated was to be part of something eternal, something that stretched beyond the confines of mortal life. Yet, these cults were not without their challenges. Their secrecy often aroused suspicion, their foreign origins raising eyebrows among the Roman elite. Still, they endured, thriving in the spaces where people sought solace and belonging. For in a world of shifting empires and fleeting glories, the promise of transformation, of being touched by the divine, was a beacon no force could extinguish. Even now, the echoes of these mysteries linger in the imagination, their allure undimmed by the passage of time. They remind us of the enduring human quest for connection, for understanding, for something greater than ourselves. The torches may have been extinguished, the sanctuaries long abandoned, but the flame they kindled in the human spirit burns on, an eternal testament to the power of faith and wonder. The air was thick with anticipation, heavy with the scent of incense and ancient stone. At Delphi, on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the ground trembled with a weight that could not be seen, only felt. People came from far and wide, crossing miles of rugged terrain, seeking a glimpse into their futures, hoping for a sign, a whisper from the gods. There, at the center of the temple, the oracle of Apollo sat in her sacred chamber, the Pythia, her body swaying gently as if she was already part of the earth itself. Her words came not from her own lips, but from something greater, something vast and unknowable. They were cryptic, often jumbled, a mixture of divine wisdom and human confusion, but the crowd listening would hang on every syllable. They knew that the gods spoke through her, guiding their decisions, their paths, their fates. The oracle was the bridge between the mortal world and the divine. She was the chosen one, the vessel of prophecy, her mind intertwined with the voices of Apollo, and through her, all the unknowns of the future seemed just within reach. Those who came to Delphi were not only seeking answers but understanding. They didn't just want to know what would happen, they wanted to know why. They hoped to see a clearer path ahead, to glimpse the future in the hazy mists of time. The oracle's cryptic words might have seemed vague, but the weight they carried, whether they spoke of peace or war, love or loss, was immeasurable. A single phrase could change the course of a kingdom, a family, a life. It was here, in these sacred halls, that destiny took shape, and fate became a tangible force. While the Greeks revered their oracles, the Romans, too, had their own ways of seeking divine guidance, but they looked to the sky. Their methods were less mystical in nature, but no less serious in their implications. They turned their eyes upward, toward the flight of birds and the patterns of nature, believing that the gods spoke through the natural world, signaling their will in the very fabric of life. It was a practice that gave weight to even the smallest detail of existence, reminding people that every moment was connected to a greater, divine plan. Augury, the art of interpreting the flight of birds, became one of the most respected practices in Roman society. Priests known as augurs would gather at the moment of an important decision, before a battle, the founding of a city, or the selection of a leader. They would watch the skies, carefully observing the direction in which the birds flew, the number of birds, and their movements. It was in these fleeting moments that they believed the gods revealed their intentions. A bird flying to the left might indicate a bad omen, while one flying to the right suggested favor from the gods. The ritual was precise, calculated, and required a deep understanding of the natural world, of patterns that went unnoticed by most. It wasn't just superstition, it was the belief that the gods had woven their will into every aspect of nature, guiding humanity through signs and symbols. But augury was just one part of the Roman practice of divination. The haruspices, another group of priests, took a different approach. They examined the entrails of sacrificed animals, particularly the liver, looking for signs of the gods' favor or wrath. The way the liver was shaped, the color of the blood, even the consistency of the flesh, all of it was carefully scrutinized, and the haruspices would interpret these signs to understand what the gods had planned for the people. The process was gruesome to some, but to the Romans, it was no less important than the flight of a bird or the prophecy of the oracle. It was in these moments that the fate of the empire, the lives of leaders, and the prosperity of families could be sealed. To the Greeks, oracles were mystical, distant, and filled with the air of mystery. To the Romans, divination was about understanding the natural world signs, about making sense of the cosmos through observation and ritual. Both were ways of connecting with the divine, of stepping into the current of something greater than themselves. But what connected them all, whether through the whispers of the oracle at Delphi or the flight of a bird in the Roman sky, was the belief that fate could be known, that the gods, in their infinite wisdom, would offer signs if only the right eyes were there to see them. And yet, not all who sought these answers were prepared for what they might find. The oracle at Delphi was not just a source of prophecy, it was a place of great mystery and danger. To seek knowledge from the gods meant to risk the wrath of those who could not be understood. The words of the oracle could be as much a curse as a blessing. Take, for example, King Croesus of Lydia. When he sought the oracle's guidance before going to war with Persia, he was told that if he went to war, he would destroy a great empire. Confident in his own strength, he marched forward, only to have his own empire destroyed by the Persians. The gods had spoken, but their message was not as clear as he had hoped. In the end, it was a tragic reminder of how easily the future can slip out of our grasp, no matter how carefully we try to predict it. The Romans, too, were no strangers to misreading the signs. Despite their careful attention to omens and rituals, there were moments when their interpretations were flawed, when the will of the gods was beyond their understanding. It was a humbling reminder that divination, though powerful, was not foolproof. The gods, and their complexity, often remained beyond human comprehension. In the end, what tied these practices together, whether in the temples of Delphi, the Roman sky, or the sacrificial altars, was the human desire to understand the great unknown, to peer into the future and find a way forward. The act of seeking divine guidance was a way of asserting control over the uncontrollable, a way of finding meaning in a world that often seemed chaotic. It was a reflection of the hope that no matter how uncertain the future might be, there was always something greater, something divine, that could offer a guiding hand. The sun sets slowly over the Athenian Acropolis, casting long shadows across the stone, as the city's heartbeat pulses through the streets. The myths of the gods, the heroes, and the legendary battles that shaped Greek identity swirl in the air like an unspoken truth. Each tale is carefully woven into the fabric of life, not merely for entertainment, but as a way of understanding who they are. The stories of Athena's wisdom, of Heracles' trials, of the Trojan War, these myths were the living, breathing foundation of Greek society. They were the lenses through which people saw themselves and their world, an ever-present reminder of what it meant to be Greek. It was more than just entertainment. These stories, passed down from generation to generation, were a reflection of the Greek ideals, bravery, justice, wisdom, and the complex interplay between fate and free will. They didn't just tell tales of gods and monsters, they gave the Greeks a framework for understanding their place in the world. The gods were not just distant beings, they were part of the everyday life, their actions serving as both examples and warnings. Heroes were not always flawless, they were complex, human figures who struggled with their own flaws and imperfections. And through these stories, the people of Greece were reminded that greatness was not just about power, it was about the choices one made, the struggles one faced, and the legacy left behind. As much as Greek mythology was about culture, identity, and belief, it was also about how the Greeks viewed their relationship with the divine and with each other. Their myths were woven together with threads of personal destiny, civic duty, and cosmic justice. It was an understanding that the gods were both the creators and the destroyers of empires. The stories of kings and queens, of battles won and lost, were meant to teach people about their roles within a larger, divine plan. And in this, Greek mythology helped to shape the very core of Greek society. But when Rome rose to prominence, the role of mythology began to shift. The stories that once carried the wisdom of gods and the weight of human experience were now repurposed, transformed into tools for political power. In the Roman world, myths were not merely stories, they were propaganda, carefully constructed to serve the needs of the state. The stories of the Trojan hero Aeneas, for example, were not just about heroism and adventure, they were the foundation upon which the Roman Empire was built. Aeneas's journey, as recounted by Virgil in the Aeneid, was the story of Rome's divine origin. His escape from Troy, the founding of the city of Lavinium, and his eventual rise as the progenitor of Rome's future leaders were not just the tales of a hero, they were the tale of the Roman people's own destiny. Through Aeneas, the Romans linked their rise to divine will. They were not merely a conquering people, they were the chosen people, the ones destined to bring order and civilization to the world. Rome's greatness, as told through the myths, was no accident. It was the fulfillment of prophecy, the inevitable outcome of divine favor. And in this retelling of myth, the Romans elevated their empire to a status that went far beyond the physical realm. Rome's gods were no longer just part of the natural order, they were the stewards of the state, the guardians of its power. The myths of Rome were not about personal glory or the moral struggles of individuals, they were about the unshakable might of the state. From the founding of Rome by Romulus and Remus to the victory of Augustus and the establishment of the Pax Romana, Roman mythology was a tool to legitimize their imperial power, to show that the rise of Rome was part of a larger, inevitable cosmic order. These myths were used to shape the identity of the Roman citizen, to remind them of their duty to the state. The story of Aeneas, for instance, was not just about his heroism. It was about his duty to his people and his ancestors. It was a call to the Romans to honor their duty to their city, to their empire, and to the gods who had chosen them. By embracing this mythology, the Romans saw themselves not as ordinary people but as the inheritors of a divine legacy. Unlike the Greeks, whose myths were rooted in philosophical inquiry, moral lessons, and the complexities of the human experience, the Romans used their myths as a direct means of state building. The gods of the Roman pantheon were no longer just distant figures, they were active participants in the political and military life of the empire. Jupiter, the king of the gods, was not just a figure of divine power. He was a symbol of Roman authority, the protector of the state. Mars, the god of war, was not just a warrior deity, he embodied the military might that was at the heart of Roman expansion. Roman rulers, too, were keenly aware of the power of myth to shape their image. Emperors like Augustus used mythological imagery to present themselves as living gods, imbued with divine right. The story of their rise to power was presented not as a political maneuver, but as a fulfillment of divine prophecy. Augustus didn't just create the Pax Romana, he was the fulfillment of Aeneas's journey, the culmination of the will of the gods. This use of myth as political narrative was a masterstroke of statecraft. While the Greeks saw their myths as a reflection of human struggles and divine justice, the Romans transformed these myths into tools for consolidating power and ensuring loyalty. Through myth, the Romans shaped their world, molded their citizens, and justified their empire. But beneath the grandeur of empire building, beneath the power of myth, was a subtle reminder of what it meant to live within the confines of a divine order. In both Greek and Roman mythology, the gods were not just figures of distant power, they were integral to the very fabric of life. The Greeks understood this, weaving the divine into the story of their everyday existence. The Romans, too, understood the power of myth, but they used it to secure their empire's place in the world. Both civilizations, in their own ways, saw mythology as something larger than stories. It was the key to understanding their past, their present, and their future. But where the Greeks used myth as a mirror to reflect the complexities of human existence, the Romans used it as a lens to magnify their power and secure their dominance. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore, the scent of salt in the air, and the weight of destiny hanging over the heroes, Homer's words echo through time, reverberating across centuries. It is the calm before the storm as Achilles stands poised at the gates of Troy, his fate written in the stars, his rage burning brighter than the fires of war itself. In the Iliad, Homer paints a world where gods walk among men, where every battle is fought with the weight of immortality, and where every action, every choice, brings the hero one step closer to the inevitable. In these ancient lines, you feel the pull of something much greater than the clash of swords. It is the struggle of a soul at war with its own nature, the crushing realization that the greatest heroes are often the most broken. Achilles, who was destined for glory, cannot escape the tide of fate. He is a man of great power, yet powerless to change his destiny, his emotions swirling like the storm clouds gathering over the battlefield. And in his moment of rage, you feel the ache of a broken heart, the pain of knowing that the very thing he loves, his honor, will lead him to his own destruction. The Iliad does not just tell the story of a war, it tells the story of the human spirit, torn between love, hate, pride, and the weight of divine will. The heroes are not invincible gods, they are fragile beings who must face the consequences of their flaws. Homer's words pull you into this world where immortality does not come without sacrifice, and where greatness is often born from suffering. It is a raw, emotional journey that shakes you to the core. Across the sea, in the land of Rome, Virgil's Aeneid rises up like a shadow. Here, the hero is not driven by rage, but by a sense of duty. Aeneas, the Trojan prince, is destined not for personal glory, but for the founding of a new empire. His journey is one of sacrifice, of placing the needs of his people before his own desires. Yet, in his heart, you can feel the struggle of a man who must choose between love and duty, between the past and the future. Virgil's tale, while echoing the grandeur of Homer's epics, is also deeply reflective of Rome's identity. Aeneas is not just a hero, he is the embodiment of Roman virtues, piety, duty, and the belief in a higher calling. His story is one of endurance, of rising from the ashes of Troy to build a new home for his people. But in every step of his journey, you can see the weight of the Roman state pressing upon his shoulders, a reminder that greatness often demands sacrifice. The Aeneid is a story of loss and perseverance, of a man who must bury his past to secure the future of a nation. Yet, despite their differences, the two epics share a common thread. They are both stories of heroes caught between personal desires and the overwhelming demands of fate. Achilles and Aeneas are two sides of the same coin. One is driven by emotion, by the heat of battle and personal vengeance. The other is driven by a sense of responsibility, by the duty to his people. And yet, both are trapped by the forces beyond their control, by the gods who shape their destinies and the tragic realities of their lives. As the echoes of these epic tales resonate through the ages, so too does the tradition of tragedy and drama in both Greek and Roman cultures. Greek tragedies, like those written by Sophocles and Euripides, open the door to a world where the gods demand retribution and where human flaws lead to devastating consequences. Oedipus, the king who cannot escape his fate, walks into his own ruin, unknowingly fulfilling the prophecy that he tried so hard to avoid. His story is one of the cruelest ironies, a man who is blinded not only by his physical eyes, but by his inability to understand the forces that shape his life. In the world of Greek tragedy, the gods are not benevolent beings who guide and protect. They are capricious, often indifferent to the suffering of humans. They demand respect, and if that respect is not given, they bring about ruin. And yet, in the midst of this divine cruelty, the Greeks taught the world something profound, that it is in the face of suffering, in the darkest moments of life, that true strength is found. The tragic hero, like Oedipus or Antigone, is not defined by their triumphs, but by their ability to endure, to confront their own flaws, and to face the consequences of their actions, no matter how painful. The Romans, however, would take this idea and transform it. In their version of drama, the gods were not just figures of fate, they were symbols of the power of state, of the empire's will. Roman tragedies, though fewer in number, still carried the echoes of their Greek predecessors. Yet, the focus was often not on the individual hero's downfall, but on the collective fate of Rome. Tragedy in the Roman context was often a reflection of the empire's struggles, its victories, and its very identity. And just as Greek tragedy explored the limits of human understanding and control, Roman drama sought to understand the balance between individual virtue and the demands of the state. Both Greek and Roman epics and tragedies have one thing in common: they challenge the very essence of what it means to be human. They expose the raw truth of existence, where glory is often fleeting, and the consequences of one's actions are inevitable. In the world of these ancient tales, every victory is shadowed by a loss, and every hero is doomed to face the consequences of their choices. The gods are not there to comfort, but to shape, to test, to destroy, and to create. These stories of heroes and tragedy have survived for thousands of years, not just because they are tales of adventure or war, but because they speak to something deeply human. They show us the struggle between duty and desire, between love and fate, between the self and the world around us. Whether it is the rage of Achilles or the piety of Aeneas, whether it is the tragedy of Oedipus or the quiet strength of Antigone, these ancient stories remain timeless because they remind us that our own lives, too, are shaped by forces beyond our control. And yet, it is how we respond to those forces, how we endure, that defines us. The world is full of stories, but there are those rare tales that resonate not only because of their adventure or spectacle, but because they force us to look inward. They make us ask questions about who we are, why we exist, and what it all means. In the bustling streets of ancient Athens, the great thinkers of the time were sitting in quiet rooms, their minds filled with the stories that shaped their world. But these philosophers weren't just marveling at the gods and monsters that populated Greek myths, they were questioning them, reshaping them, and reinterpreting them in a way that would forever alter the course of thought. Imagine Plato, sitting in the shade of a tree, pondering the very nature of reality. He wasn't the type to just accept things as they appeared. In his Republic, he talks about the world of forms, the idea that what we see is only a shadow of the true, ideal version of things. And when it came to mythology, Plato was deeply skeptical of how it was portrayed to the people. For him, the gods of the Greeks weren't perfect beings to be admired, they were flawed. They lied, they fought, and they deceived. How could these gods, with all their vices, be the models of virtue and morality for humans? Plato's view was radical. He believed that the myths told by poets like Homer and Hesiod were dangerous. They painted a picture of the gods that was misleading, one that might inspire people to imitate the gods' worst traits. Imagine the impact of this thought. The very stories that had been passed down for generations, stories that formed the foundation of the Greek worldview, were suddenly under attack. For Plato, the myths needed to be refined. He suggested that instead of portraying gods as vengeful or capricious, they should be seen as the embodiment of pure, unchanging goodness. The gods, in Plato's view, should reflect the virtues that humans should aspire to: wisdom, justice, and temperance. But while Plato wrestled with the myths and their place in society, Aristotle took a different approach. To Aristotle, the myths were not simply stories to be reshaped or discarded. He saw them as rich, symbolic representations of human experience. Aristotle was more interested in understanding what these myths could teach us about the world and about ourselves. In his Poetics, he examined the role of tragedy in literature, and through this lens, he also approached mythology. Aristotle argued that the myths were not just tales of divine intervention, they were reflections of human flaws, choices, and consequences. Where Plato wanted to purify the myths, Aristotle accepted them as part of the human condition. He didn't seek to change them, but rather to analyze them, to understand the deep lessons they held about life's tragedies. A hero's downfall, for Aristotle, wasn't just a result of the gods' whims, but a consequence of human error, of hamartia, or tragic flaw. Think of Oedipus, whose tragic fate was sealed not by a malicious god, but by his own blindness to the truth. Aristotle saw this as a powerful message. It wasn't just the gods who shaped the course of life, but our own choices, our own weaknesses, our own inability to see the truth. The contrast between Plato and Aristotle's views on mythology couldn't be starker. Plato sought to cleanse the stories, to rid them of their flaws, while Aristotle embraced them, seeking to understand the complexity of human nature through their lens. Plato's vision was idealistic, looking to elevate humanity to a higher, purer form. Aristotle, on the other hand, was grounded in the reality of the human condition. He knew that the path to understanding lay in confronting, not avoiding, the darker aspects of life. Meanwhile, across the sea in Rome, another philosophy was beginning to take root: Stoicism. The Romans were practical people, and their philosophy reflected this mindset. For the Stoics, the myths of their Greek predecessors weren't just stories of gods and heroes, they were tools for teaching moral lessons. But the Stoics did something that set them apart from earlier interpretations of mythology. They viewed the gods not as capricious beings whose actions were beyond comprehension, but as symbols of natural law and reason. In Stoic thought, the gods weren't personal figures to be worshipped with offerings and prayers. Instead, they represented the rational order of the universe, a force that governed everything, from the rise and fall of empires to the smallest leaf falling from a tree. For Stoics like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, the myths weren't about pleasing the gods or fearing their wrath. They were about understanding the nature of the world and accepting its inevitable course. The Stoics looked to mythology for lessons about self-control, virtue, and wisdom. Take the story of Hercules, for example. To the Stoics, Hercules wasn't just a heroic figure who completed impossible tasks out of sheer strength or valor. He was a symbol of the struggle within all humans to overcome adversity, to rise above weakness, and to live according to nature. His labors were not just feats of physical prowess, they were lessons in discipline, and facing life's hardships without complaint or fear. The Stoics didn't focus on the external details of the myth, they focused on the internal journey of the hero, the struggle to live a virtuous life in the face of suffering. In this sense, Roman Stoicism gave the myths a new purpose. They weren't just tales of gods and heroes, they were reflections of how to live a good life, how to find peace in the midst of chaos. The Stoics believed that by understanding the natural order, by aligning our actions with reason, we could overcome the pain and suffering that comes with being human. The myths became a guide to living virtuously, to understanding that, like the gods, we too are part of a larger, rational plan. Both Greek and Roman philosophers saw the myths as more than mere stories. For Plato, they were corruptions that needed to be purified to reflect the truth. For Aristotle, they were complex narratives that mirrored human experience and could teach us about ourselves. And for the Stoics, the myths were timeless lessons about virtue, nature, and the wisdom that comes from accepting the world as it is. In their own ways, these philosophers were all trying to make sense of a world that was as complex as the myths themselves. They sought to find meaning in the chaos, to understand what these stories, these ancient, powerful tales, could teach us about living, about suffering, about being human. Each one, in their own way, was trying to answer the same question: how do we live the right way in a world that is often unpredictable, unjust, and full of suffering? In the end, mythology became more than just stories about gods and heroes. It became a mirror, showing us who we are, what we strive for, and the choices we must make. The myths weren't just tales of the past, they were part of an ongoing conversation, one that continues to shape the way we see the world and ourselves. In the quiet moments of dawn, when the first light of day gently kissed the marble homes of ancient Greece, a woman would kneel before a small altar in her home. She would hold a bowl of barley in her hands, whispering prayers to Hestia, the goddess of the hearth. Her voice trembled not from fear, but from the weight of tradition, from the hope that these rituals, so simple yet so profound, would keep her family safe, the fire burning steadily, and her life in harmony with the divine forces that watched over her. Across the Aegean, in Rome, a similar scene unfolded. Here, the head of a household would stand before the Lararium, a sacred shrine adorned with tiny figurines of the Lares and Penates, the protective spirits of the home. He would pour a small libation of wine or place a morsel of bread as an offering. The air was thick with incense, a smoky bridge between the mortal and the divine. In that moment, the boundaries between myth and reality blurred, as the spirits of the ancestors and the gods of the hearth became inseparable from the life of the family. These acts were not grand spectacles, nor were they the subject of epic tales sung by poets. Yet, they were the very heartbeat of mythology in daily life. For the Greeks, the hearth was not just a place to cook meals, it was the center of the home, a sacred space where the family gathered, united under the watchful eye of Hestia. Every offering, every whispered prayer, was a reminder that the gods were not distant beings in lofty heavens, but present, woven into the fabric of everyday existence. The Romans, pragmatic as they were, brought a similar reverence into their homes, but with a touch of structure and formality that reflected their love of order. The Lares, household spirits, were protectors of the family's prosperity, while the Penates safeguarded the pantry and the food supply. Together, these spirits embodied the Roman values of duty and respect for tradition. Their shrines were as essential to a Roman household as the walls that held it together. But there was more to these practices than just devotion. Beneath the surface lay a profound sense of vulnerability, a recognition that life was precarious, that the forces of the world could not always be tamed by human hands. Superstition crept into the cracks of these rituals, filling them with a sense of caution, a belief that unseen powers were always watching. In Greece, it was said that spilling salt or breaking a mirror could invite misfortune, echoes of ancient myths whispering warnings to the living. Romans carried similar fears, but they also clung to omens. Seeing a flock of birds in flight or hearing the sound of thunder at the wrong moment could change the course of a decision, even a life. These superstitions, born from the myths, were not the stuff of idle fancy. They were survival instincts wrapped in stories, passed down from one generation to the next. A Greek farmer, standing in his fields, might look up at the sky and recall the tale of Zeus hurling thunderbolts, a reminder of the power of nature and the importance of seeking the gods' favor before planting his crops. A Roman soldier, preparing for battle, might carry a small charm or recite an incantation, drawing strength not just from the gods, but from the stories that told of heroes who had faced impossible odds. The persistence of these beliefs, their entwinement with everyday life, speaks to something deeply human, the need to feel connected to forces larger than ourselves. Myths provided a framework, a way to make sense of a world that was often chaotic and unpredictable. They gave meaning to the mundane, turning the simple act of lighting a fire or setting a table into an offering, a dialogue with the divine. Yet, for all their differences, the Greeks and Romans shared a common thread in their approach to household worship and superstition, a reverence for tradition and an unshakable belief in the power of the unseen. These practices, though small in scale, carried immense weight. They were acts of faith, of hope, and of love for the gods and spirits who were believed to watch over every aspect of life. The myths may have been grand, filled with gods and monsters, but their true power lay in their ability to touch the everyday. They were not just stories told around the fire, they were the fire, the warmth that filled the home, the light that guided each day. And in the quiet moments of devotion, in the whispered prayers and the careful offerings, the Greeks and Romans found a sense of peace, a connection to something eternal, something sacred. Even now, the echoes of those ancient rituals can still be felt. The myths live on, not just in the grand epics, but in the small, quiet acts of faith that continue to define what it means to be human. For in every superstition, every whispered hope, there is a story waiting to be told, a reminder that the line between myth and life is as thin as the veil of smoke rising from an offering on the hearth. The temple stood silent, its marble pillars bathed in the golden glow of a fading sun. Once, this place had echoed with chants to Apollo, the air alive with the sound of lyres and the fervent prayers of worshippers. Now, weeds curled around the altar, and the fire that once blazed with sacred offerings had long turned to cold ash. A child walked by with his mother, tugging at her sleeve, asking who the statue was meant to honor. The mother glanced at the faded figure, shrugged, and whispered a name, a god of the old days. They moved on, leaving behind a silence that felt like mourning. This was not just the fading of a religion, but the fading of a world. The Greek and Roman myths, once vibrant and alive, were being rewritten, reimagined, or buried under the weight of a new faith. Christianity had arrived, not with the clamor of swords, but with the promise of salvation. Its quiet persistence reshaped an entire civilization, one whispered prayer at a time. For centuries, the myths had defined what it meant to understand the universe. They spoke of gods who controlled the tides and storms, who wove the fates of mortals, and whose whims could bless or destroy. They were not distant, they walked among mortals, loved them, envied them, punished and protected them. These gods had once filled the heavens and the earth, present in every rustling tree and flowing river. Yet now, their stories began to take on a different tone. The transition was not immediate. At first, the myths were not discarded but softened, reinterpreted. In some Christian texts, the gods were cast as demons, their once majestic forms recast into figures of sin and temptation. Apollo, the bringer of light, was stripped of his golden chariot and cast into shadow. Athena's wisdom was no longer divine but a reflection of human pride. The legends of Zeus, once tales of power and grandeur, became examples of immorality, lessons in what the new faith sought to transcend. But for all the efforts to suppress the old gods, their roots were too deep to be fully severed. They lingered, woven into the fabric of the very culture Christianity sought to transform. Churches rose where temples had once stood, their foundations often built on the sacred grounds of Zeus or Poseidon. The names of the gods lived on in the days of the week, in the stars, and the whispered stories passed down from grandparents to grandchildren. Even as Christianity grew stronger, the myths clung to the edges of memory, like shadows at the edge of a flickering candle. There were moments of tension, of violence even. Pagan temples were torn down, their statues defaced, their sacred fires extinguished. Yet, for every temple that fell, there were 100 quiet conversions, not born of force but of hope. A woman lighting a candle to Demeter for a bountiful harvest might, in the same breath, offer a prayer to the Christian God. The lines blurred, the old and the new coexisting in a fragile balance. But as Christianity's influence grew, the myths began to retreat into the realm of stories rather than beliefs. Ovid's Metamorphoses, once a sacred text of transformation and divine intervention, became a poetic relic, its gods reduced to literary characters. The Iliad and the Odyssey, once imbued with spiritual significance, were read as epics of human courage and folly rather than divine guidance. The myths were not gone, but they had been stripped of their power, their sacredness. Yet, even in this decline, there was a strange beauty. The myths, freed from the weight of worship, became something else entirely. They became symbols, metaphors, a language through which humanity could speak of its own struggles and triumphs. The fall of Icarus was no longer a warning from the gods, but a testament to human ambition and its limits. The love of Orpheus and Eurydice became a story of loss and longing, a mirror held up to the heart rather than the heavens. And still, echoes of the old gods found their way into Christianity itself. The Virgin Mary bore the tenderness of Demeter, her love for her son echoing across the ages. Saints emerged, each with their own domain, their miracles reminiscent of the powers once wielded by the Olympians. The Christian calendar absorbed pagan festivals, transforming them but never fully erasing their roots. The celebration of the winter solstice, once sacred to Saturn, became Christmas, a time not of worshiping the harvest but of celebrating the birth of a Savior. It was a slow transformation, marked by moments of resistance and acceptance, destruction and rebirth. The myths, though no longer believed in the same way, became immortal in a different sense. They survived not as gods, but as ideas, as symbols of the human experience. And in that survival, they found a new kind of power, one that could not be destroyed by time or faith. There is a bittersweetness to their fading, a sense of loss for a world that no longer exists. But there is also a quiet triumph in their endurance. For even as they were reinterpreted and suppressed, the myths refused to die. They lingered in the words of poets, in the brushstrokes of painters, in the imagination of every child who heard the tale of Hercules or the tragedy of Narcissus. The gods may have been dethroned, their temples abandoned, but their stories remain. They live in the spaces between belief and memory, in the echoes of a world that once was and a world that is yet to come. They are not gone, they are simply waiting, watching, their presence felt in every whispered prayer, every flicker of wonder, every moment when humanity looks to the stars and dreams of something greater. A single shaft of sunlight broke through the cracked window of an abandoned monastery, illuminating a stack of forgotten scrolls. Dust motes danced in the air, spiraling like the lost echoes of voices that once prayed there. A young scholar knelt, trembling fingers brushing against the brittle parchment, his heart pounding with the weight of his discovery. Lines of Greek filled the page, Homer's words, Virgil's echoes. It was as though the gods themselves had reached through time, offering their stories to a world that had almost forgotten them. It was the Renaissance, an age of awakening. After centuries of silence, the voices of Greek and Roman myths began to rise once more, filling the hearts of artists, poets, and dreamers. They did not return as they once were, worshipped and feared, but as muses, their stories igniting a fire of creativity that would transform the world. The gods walked again, not in temples, but in marble statues and vivid frescoes, and the lines of epic poems and the sweep of symphonies. The artists were the first to breathe life back into the myths. Michelangelo, standing before a block of marble, saw not stone but the god Apollo, his body perfect and radiant. With every strike of his chisel, the past emerged, a hymn to the beauty and power of the divine. Botticelli painted Venus rising from the sea, her golden hair cascading like sunlight on water, her gaze filled with the promise of love and beauty. In their hands, the myths became more than stories, they became visions, reminders of humanity's potential to create, to dream, to reach for the heavens. Poets, too, felt the pull of the ancient tales. Dante, wandering through his visions of hell, purgatory, and paradise, wove the threads of Greek and Roman myths into the fabric of his divine comedy. Ovid's Metamorphoses echoed in his words, the transformations of gods and mortals a reflection of the soul's journey. Petrarch wrote of love and longing with a voice that carried the weight of Aphrodite's sighs, each sonnet a tribute to the enduring power of passion and desire. But it wasn't just the artists and poets who felt the myths stirring. The thinkers, the philosophers, the humanists, they, too, turned their eyes to the past, seeking wisdom in the stories of gods and heroes. They found in the myths a reflection of their own struggles, their own questions about the nature of humanity and the universe. Aristotle's musings on tragedy became a cornerstone of Renaissance drama, his thoughts on catharsis shaping the works of playwrights like Shakespeare. The myths were not just stories, they were mirrors, holding up the light of understanding to a world eager to rediscover itself. The myths also found new homes in the hearts of those who sought knowledge. Libraries, once dark and neglected, came alive with the hum of voices reading aloud the words of Plato and Cicero, Homer and Virgil. Texts thought lost forever were rediscovered, carried from the ruins of Constantinople to the cities of Florence, Rome, and Venice. Each manuscript was a treasure, each line a thread connecting the present to the past. Scholars pored over them with a reverence that bordered on devotion, their minds set alight by the wisdom and beauty they found within. And it wasn't just the grand, sweeping tales that returned. The small, intimate stories, the loves, the losses, the quiet moments of humanity found their way into the hearts of the people. Persephone's descent into the underworld became a metaphor for the seasons, a reminder of life's cycles of death and rebirth. Orpheus' song echoed in the longing of lovers, his journey to the underworld a testament to the power of hope. These stories, so ancient and yet so timeless, wove themselves into the fabric of daily life, their truths as relevant as they had ever been. Even the gods themselves seemed to walk among mortals once more. Their faces appeared not in the heavens, but in the likeness of kings and queens, their virtues and vices reflecting the struggles of a changing world. Monarchs compared themselves to Jupiter, warriors to Mars, and lovers to Venus, their ambitions cloaked in the grandeur of myth. The myths were no longer just stories of the past, they were tools, symbols of power and identity in a world rediscovering its place in the cosmos. Yet, there was something bittersweet in their return. These gods and heroes, so full of life in the hands of the Renaissance masters, were no longer worshipped. Their temples lay in ruins, their altars cold. They had become memories, their power transformed into inspiration. But perhaps that was their greatest triumph, not to command, but to inspire, not to rule, but to awaken. As the myths spread, they transcended the boundaries of culture and language, becoming a universal language of the human spirit. They whispered to every heart that dared to dream, to every hand that sought to create, to every mind that reached for understanding. They were no longer confined to Greece and Rome, they belonged to the world, their stories woven into the tapestry of human history. And so, the gods and heroes of ancient myths lived again, not as beings of power, but as symbols of what humanity could achieve. Their voices, once silenced, now sang in the brushstrokes of Raphael, the verses of Milton, the symphonies of Monteverdi. They had become immortal, not through worship, but through the enduring power of their stories, stories that reminded a Renaissance world, and all the worlds that followed, of the beauty and strength that lay within the human soul. The moon hung low over a forest cloaked in mist, its light spilling silver onto ancient stones. The wind carried whispers through the trees, soft murmurs of voices long forgotten. It was as though the very earth was remembering something, some fragment of a story buried beneath centuries of silence. Standing in this enchanted stillness, a poet closed his eyes and felt the heartbeat of another time, a time when gods roamed the land and every shadow held a secret. The 19th century was an age of longing, a yearning for what had been, for the magic of a world that seemed so much richer, so much fuller, than the industrial haze swallowing the present. It was an ache that settled in the hearts of poets, artists, and dreamers, pushing them to seek the mythic past. They didn't just want to remember the old stories, they wanted to feel them, to live them, to bring them back to life in a way that would leave the soul trembling. The Romantics were consumed by this hunger. They looked to the myths not as relics, but as treasures, each one glimmering with truths that modern life seemed to have forgotten. For them, the myths were not merely tales of gods and heroes, they were echoes of a world where nature and humanity were entwined, where every mountain was sacred and every river flowed with the tears of nymphs. This reverence poured into their art, filling it with beauty so raw, so vivid, it could break your heart. Wordsworth, walking beside a quiet lake, felt the spirit of ancient myths rise within him. To him, the hills and valleys were alive, imbued with the same wonder that had inspired the Greeks to sing of nymphs and dryads. Keats, with his pen trembling in his hand, wrote of Endymion, of gods who fell in love with mortals and turned their passions into stars. His words were a hymn to the immortality of beauty, a desperate plea to hold onto the fleeting, the ephemeral. In their poems and paintings, the myths breathed again. Turner's canvases swirled with the wild majesty of nature, skies that roared with Zeus's thunder and seas that raged with Poseidon's fury. Friedrich painted solitary figures gazing out at the sublime, their silhouettes dwarfed by mountains that seemed to hold the whispers of gods. The myths were no longer confined to temples or scrolls, they were etched into the landscapes, woven into the fabric of human emotion. But this fascination with the mythic past was not merely an escape. It was a rebellion, a cry against the cold, unfeeling march of progress that threatened to strip the world of its soul. The myths stood as a reminder of a time when wonder was a way of life, when people looked at the stars and saw not burning gas but gods, not calculations but poetry. To the Romantics, the myths were proof that humanity had once been capable of magic, of seeing the extraordinary in the ordinary. The myth of Prometheus burned especially bright in the hearts of these dreamers. He was the rebel, the bringer of fire, the one who defied the gods to give humanity a chance to rise. To Mary Shelley, he became the tragic heart of her novel, Frankenstein, his spirit entwined with the hubris and sorrow of modern creation. To Byron and Shelley, he was the ultimate symbol of resistance, of a spirit unbroken by the chains of tyranny. In their hands, Prometheus was no longer a figure of the ancient world, he was a force, a flame that burned in the hearts of all who dared to defy. The myths also found their way into music, their echoes lingering in every note. Beethoven's symphonies thundered with the might of gods, each crescendo a battle, each diminuendo a hymn. Wagner, with his operas, wove entire worlds of myth, his music a tapestry of gods and heroes, of love and loss. Listening to his works was like stepping into another time, a time when the lines between mortal and divine blurred, when every note carried the weight of destiny. And yet, for all their grandeur, the Romantics also found beauty in the quieter myths, the ones that whispered instead of roared. They were drawn to tales of love and longing, of gods who wept and mortals who dared to dream. They found themselves in the tragedy of Orpheus, whose music could charm even the dead but could not save the one he loved. They wept for Narcissus, whose beauty became his prison, and for Psyche, who endured unimaginable trials for the sake of love. These myths were not just stories, they were reflections of the human soul, its light and its shadow, its glory and its pain. This obsession with the mythic past was not confined to the poets and artists. Ordinary people, too, felt its pull. They gathered in parlors and read aloud the epics of Homer, their voices trembling with the weight of the words. They looked at the ruins of temples and felt a pang of longing, a connection to something vast and ancient. They saw in the myths a way to make sense of their own lives, a way to find meaning in a world that often seemed so chaotic, so cruel. But perhaps the most powerful thing about this fascination with the myths was the way it bridged the past and the present. The stories of gods and heroes became more than tales, they became a part of the human story, a reminder that we are all connected by the same desires, the same fears, the same dreams. The Romantics, in their longing for the past, did not merely revive the myths, they made them eternal, transforming them into a language of the heart that transcends time. And so, the myths lived on, their voices rising through the centuries, filling the world with their beauty, their power, their truth. They reminded a world rushing towards the future of the treasures it had left behind, of the wonder and magic that still lingered in the shadows. And as long as there were hearts that longed for something more, for something eternal, the myths would never truly fade. A child sits cross-legged on a living room carpet, clutching a controller as their character, a warrior with divine lineage, faces a colossal, serpentine beast. Lightning crackles across the screen as the sky splits open, and the god of thunder steps forth. In that moment, the child isn't merely playing a game, they are stepping into a myth, living it, feeling the pulse of ancient legends come alive in their hands. It's not just a battle, it's a story older than time itself, woven into the rhythms of modern life. In the flickering glow of cinema screens, the myths find new breath. A hero stumbles into an ancient temple, the walls covered in carvings of forgotten gods. A whisper echoes, at once ominous and alluring, drawing the hero deeper. The camera pans to reveal an artifact that hums with power, its surface etched with runes that speak of curses and glory. The audience leans forward, captivated. Somewhere in the quiet of the theater, a tear falls as the hero makes the ultimate sacrifice, their fate entwined with legends that once lived in marble and parchment. In books, the myths wear fresh disguises, their bones reshaped, but their souls intact. A boy with a scar on his forehead learns he is not just ordinary but chosen, tied to forces as old as the world. A demigod with a sarcastic wit navigates modern cities while carrying the burden of ancient prophecies. These stories carry the heart of the old myths, speaking of quests and trials, of love that defies death and power that demands sacrifice. They remind readers, young and old, that the gods and heroes of yesterday still walk among us, hidden in the pages of fantasy and adventure. But it is not only through stories that myths breathe in modern life, they sing in the music of video games, a symphony of gods and mortals, choices and consequences. Players steer the fate of a Spartan warrior who defies Olympus, climbing the peak of Mount Olympus not as a worshiper but as a challenger. They guide a Norse god, withered and weary, through snow-laden forests, his child at his side, their bond tested by the weight of prophecy. The gods may be fictional here, yet their struggles, their hopes, and their downfall strike a chord that feels all too human. And then there is the silver screen, where myths explode in epic proportions. A demigod soars across the sky, wielding a hammer that calls storms. Another rises from the depths of the ocean, crowned with coral and commanding the tides. These gods and heroes are no longer confined to the myths of a single culture, they belong to the world now, a tapestry of stories that blur the lines between ancient lore and modern imagination. They teach millions to believe in strength and resilience and the enduring power of the human spirit. Yet myths don't only thrive in the grand gestures of battle and triumph. They find a quiet power in whispered tales of forbidden love, in the moments when a character looks into the eyes of their beloved and feels the weight of eternity. In these modern interpretations, the myths shed their grandeur and become intimate, tender, deeply personal. They remind us that the divine isn't always distant, it's in the simple, fragile moments of being human. Sometimes, myths emerge where we least expect them, cloaked in humor and satire, their power intact despite their playful disguise. A series of quirky gods navigate modern-day New York, their immortality juxtaposed with parking tickets and cell phone reception. A teenage demigod fumbles with his powers, his struggles as awkward as they are profound. These reinterpretations remind us that myths are not static, they adapt, evolve, and endure, just as humanity does. And yet, even as myths wear new faces, they never lose the pulse of their origins. In every retelling, there is the faint echo of ancient fires, of stories told under starlit skies, of voices rising in prayer and song. The myths remind us of who we were, even as they shape who we are becoming. They are not relics, they are alive, woven into the fabric of our stories, our dreams, our everyday lives. In a quiet corner of the world, someone picks up a book about gods and heroes, their fingers trembling with anticipation. In a bustling city, another watches a film that stirs something primal, something sacred. And somewhere, in the glow of a screen, a player pauses their game, staring at the scene before them, a fallen hero, a weeping god, a world forever changed. The myths are there, whispering, reminding us of the stories that live within us all. A storm brews over the mountains, lightning splitting the heavens as thunder shakes the earth. On one peak, Zeus, the king of Greek gods, wields his mighty thunderbolt, a symbol of divine authority and unyielding power. Across a distant fjord, Thor, the Norse god of thunder, grips Mjolnir, his enchanted hammer, the force of his strength echoing through the cosmos. Though oceans and centuries separate them, their tales speak in unison, threads of humanity's yearning for power, protection, and justice intertwined. In the deserts of Egypt, the sun blazes mercilessly over the Nile, and Ra, the sun god, journeys across the sky in his celestial boat, a guardian of light and life. Thousands of miles away, Apollo, the radiant Greek god, stands tall, embodying the same brilliance, guiding his fiery chariot. Both figures hold the sun in their grasp, not just as a celestial body but as a beacon of hope, order, and divine balance. The resonance between their myths reminds us that even in disparate cultures, the sun binds humanity with its promise of life and renewal. A mother weeps inconsolably in the underworld, her grief for her lost child saturating the air. In Greek lore, it is Demeter mourning Persephone, stolen away to Hades' dark realm. Her tears bring the winter, her joy the spring, a cycle of loss and renewal that governs the seasons. In Egypt, Isis scours the world for Osiris, piecing together his fragmented body, her love defying death itself. These myths, though separated by geography, mirror each other's anguish and devotion, painting a portrait of love that transcends all boundaries. Turn to the icy realms of the Norse, and you find Odin, the All-Father, sacrificing his eye for wisdom, hanging from Yggdrasil, the world tree, to gain knowledge. His tale reverberates with echoes of Prometheus, who defied Zeus to gift fire, a symbol of enlightenment to humanity. Both gods suffer for their people, their sacrifices bearing the weight of the world's progress. It's a testament to the universality of wisdom's price, a narrative as old as human curiosity itself. In the labyrinth of myths, the tricksters dance, weaving chaos and creation together. Loki, the Norse mischief maker, shifts between cunning schemes and outright rebellion, challenging the gods' order. Hermes, the Greek messenger, though not entirely malevolent, shares Loki's wit and penchant for crossing boundaries. They embody the disruptive force of creativity, proving that even the gods need a spark of chaos to evolve. But it is not just gods who bridge cultures, it's the heroes too. Heracles, the Greek demigod, slays beasts and performs impossible labors, his strength and resilience celebrated across time. Gilgamesh, the Sumerian king, wrestles with mortality and loss, embarking on a quest that echoes Heracles' search for meaning in a world ruled by divine whims. These heroes, though molded by their unique cultures, carry the same essence, flawed, courageous, and endlessly human. The end of the world looms in many traditions, and their myths confronted with striking parallels. The Norse Ragnarok paints a grim picture of gods and monsters clashing in an apocalyptic battle, the old order consumed to make way for the new. In Greco-Roman myth, the flood narrative, Deucalion and Pyrrha surviving Zeus' wrath by building an ark, mirrors countless other stories of divine reckoning, from Noah in the Bible to Utnapishtim in Mesopotamian lore. These tales remind us of humanity's collective fear of endings and our enduring hope for rebirth. And what of the afterlife? In Greek myths, the underworld sprawls in shadowy realms, Hades ruling over souls with impartial severity. The Egyptian Duat, with its intricate mazes and trials, offers a vivid counterpart, where the heart is weighed against the feather of Maat to determine one's eternal fate. These visions of life beyond death, though varied, reflect the same existential questions: what lies beyond? What defines a life well lived? Even the primordial chaos from which creation springs holds universal weight. The Greeks speak of Nyx and chaos, the dark void birthing existence. The Norse recount Ginnungagap, the yawning abyss where fire and ice collided to form the first beings. These cosmic origins, told with differing details, share a common awe at the birth of everything from nothing, a mystery that binds all cultures in wonder. In the quiet moments of these myths, we glimpse shared humanity. A mother's tear for her child, a hero's battle cry, a god's sacrifice for wisdom, these emotions cross borders and centuries. They whisper that we are not so different, that our fears, our hopes, our dreams, and our questions have always been the same. In the dim glow of the firelight, shadows danced across the walls of the ancient cave. A lone figure, wrapped in furs, etched a story into the stone, a hero with a lion's strength, a wise guide with eyes that had seen eternity, a mother shielding her child from the storm. These shapes, etched thousands of years ago, were not merely figures but echoes of something deeper, something timeless. They were not just stories but archetypes, seeds planted in the soul of humanity that would sprout again and again in myths, in dreams, in life itself. The hero rises, again and again. In one story, it's Perseus slaying the Gorgon, his courage forged by the weight of his destiny. In another, it's King Arthur pulling a sword from the stone, his strength tempered by the wisdom he must yet earn. The hero's journey, no matter where it begins, stirs something primal in us, the call to face fear, to conquer chaos, to emerge transformed. It is not just their victory that moves us, but their struggle, their vulnerability. The hero carries our fears and dreams, showing us that the climb is worth the fall. And then there is the guide, the mentor who appears when all seems lost. In the shadow of the labyrinth, Daedalus whispers to Theseus, offering a thread of salvation. On a windswept plain, the Norse god Odin shares his wisdom with mortals, speaking of courage in the face of inevitable doom. These figures, old, wise, and often burdened, serve as the lanterns that light the way. They are the embodiment of hope, reminding us that even in the darkest nights, someone has walked this path before and left a glimmer of light behind. The mother stands eternal, a beacon of love and sacrifice. Demeter, cradling the hope of spring as she mourns Persephone, reminds us of the boundless strength of a parent's love. In Egyptian lore, Isis weeps and toils to piece together Osiris, her devotion defying the chasm of death. This archetype doesn't merely comfort, it protects, nourishes, and demands reverence for the power of creation and endurance. The trickster dances at the edge of order, pulling at the threads of the cosmos. Loki in Norse mythology spins chaos into the fabric of fate, a mischievous force challenging the gods' authority. In Greek tales, Hermes flits between worlds, a thief and a messenger, both defying and serving the divine. The trickster's role is not to destroy but to disrupt, to test boundaries, to remind us that creativity often begins with chaos. The shadow looms, dark and unrelenting, embodying our fears and desires. In the Greek myths, it's Hades, the stern ruler of the underworld, a mirror of mortality itself. In the depths of Norse mythology, it is Fenrir, the monstrous wolf destined to bring destruction. The shadow archetype forces us to confront what we avoid, the inevitability of loss, the temptation of power, the fragility of existence. Yet, in that confrontation lies growth, for only by facing the shadow can we claim the light. The eternal child, a symbol of innocence and new beginnings, whispers of renewal. In the Hindu tradition, Krishna as a playful child embodies joy and divine love. In Greek myths, Eros flutters as the mischievous god of love, sparking chaos with his arrows. This archetype speaks to the possibility of starting over, of rediscovering wonder in a world that often feels heavy with its own weight. And there, always, is the great Mother Earth herself, nurturing and consuming in equal measure. Gaia in Greek mythology is both creator and destroyer, the soil from which life springs and to which it inevitably returns. In countless traditions, the earth is not just a backdrop but a force, a reminder of our place within a cycle larger than ourselves. The archetype of the earth grounds us, urging humility and reverence. These figures, these recurring motifs, are not just elements of mythology but echoes of our collective psyche. They are the threads that connect humanity across time and space. They whisper of fears we dare not voice, dreams we scarcely comprehend, and truths we cannot escape. They are why a tale told thousands of years ago still brings tears to our eyes, still quickens our heartbeat, still makes us pause to wonder. The archetypes remind us that we are not alone, that the stories we live are part of a larger story, one that has been told before and will be told again. And in that telling, in the endless repetition of the hero's rise, the shadow's menace, the mother's love, and the trickster's dance, there is a beauty that binds us all. A distant battlefield stretches before you, filled with the echoes of clashing swords and cries of defiance. At the heart of the chaos stands a figure cloaked in legend, a hero whose name has carried nations through centuries. For the Greeks, it was Achilles, a warrior who represented both their strength and their vulnerability. For the Romans, it was Aeneas, a survivor who bore the weight of founding an empire. These myths were not just stories, they were identities forged in the crucible of human longing, pain, and triumph. Achilles, fierce and untamed, symbolized the unyielding spirit of Greece. His rage and his grief were their own, his victories a reflection of their pride. But beneath his godlike exterior lay a poignant truth, his mortality, the Achilles heel that reminded them that even heroes could fall. Achilles' myth was not just a tale of war, but a mirror to the Greek soul, a testament to their passion, their ambition, and their acceptance of life's fragility. The Romans, pragmatic and unyielding, found their identity in Aeneas, a man defined not by rage, but by duty. Fleeing the ruins of Troy with his father on his shoulders and his son by his side, Aeneas carried not just his family, but the hope of a new civilization. His sacrifices became Rome's foundation, a myth that justified their empire's might and endurance. In Aeneas, they saw themselves, not conquerors driven by ambition alone, but guardians of a divine destiny. Centuries later, these ancient myths wove themselves into the very fabric of national pride. Greek independence movements in the 19th century called upon the spirits of Achilles and Odysseus, rallying under their banners as symbols of defiance against oppression. They sang songs of gods and heroes, believing that their ancestors' glory flowed in their veins. The myths, long dormant, roared to life, lighting fires in hearts and fueling revolutions. Rome's mythology, too, found its way into the machinery of identity. Leaders cast themselves as new Aeneases, saviors of a crumbling world or heralds of an unshakable future. The she-wolf who nursed Romulus and Remus adorned banners and coins, her image a reminder that even empires had humble, mythic beginnings. Myth became the foundation for power, a claim to destiny that could not be denied. As time rolled forward, these ancient stories refused to fade. In the modern world, myths reshaped themselves, bending and twisting to meet the needs of the times. Achilles, once the embodiment of warrior glory, found his reflection in anti-heroes who grappled with inner demons, their strength tempered by doubt. Aeneas, steadfast and resolute, became a symbol of survival and hope for those displaced by war and tragedy, his journey across the seas echoing in the stories of refugees seeking new homelands. In the quiet halls of art and literature, myths whispered their way into new identities. Poets reimagined gods and heroes, casting them as reflections of personal struggles or societal upheaval. Painters gave fresh colors to age-old legends, draping them in the shadows of modern anxieties or the light of newfound aspirations. Myths became both anchors to the past and vessels for the future, shaping how we see ourselves and our place in the world. Today, as nations grapple with their histories, myths still find their place in the discourse of identity. They are both a bridge to heritage and a battleground for meaning. The stories of ancient Greece and Rome, long stripped of their original context, are reborn in debates about power, culture, and belonging. Achilles stands tall not only as a warrior, but as a symbol of resilience and individuality. Aeneas, once the founder of an empire, now speaks to the endurance of human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. These myths, immortal and ever-changing, remain a part of who we are. They are whispers from the past, urging us to remember where we came from, and promises for the future, reminding us of what we can be. Through them, we understand that identity is not a fixed point but a story, one we inherit, one we rewrite, one we pass on to those who will follow. Myths never stay the same. They slip through our fingers, like water running down a mountain, changing and evolving with the passing of time. In one place, they're told one way, with all their original grandeur, while in another, they take on a new form, shaped by the needs, desires, and struggles of a different age. Take the story of Heracles, for example. To the Greeks, he was a symbol of strength, a man who could take on gods and monsters, a figure of raw power and uncontrollable rage. But as the centuries passed and his story traveled from the streets of Athens to the courts of Rome, Heracles became something else, a more refined figure, still strong, but now representing the virtues of duty and sacrifice. And then, in the hands of Renaissance artists, he was no longer just a hero, he was a symbol of the human struggle to rise above nature and achieve greatness. Each retelling, each adaptation, brought something new into the story, shaped by the time and place it was told. Myths don't just grow old. They evolve. They adapt to the world around them, to the minds that listen, to the hearts that need them. That's the thing about myth, they don't belong to one people, one place, or one time. They live in every moment, ever-changing, ever-shifting. Think about the way the story of the Trojan War moves from the epic poetry of Homer to modern interpretations. In the ancient world, it was about honor, pride, and the gods' intervention in the affairs of mortals. But fast forward to the modern world, and the same story becomes a commentary on the human cost of war, the destruction of families, the endless cycles of violence. The characters are no longer just heroes and villains. They are humans, complex and flawed, trapped in a tragic situation that seems all too familiar. Myths are like rivers. They carry the weight of the past, but they are constantly in motion, always reshaping the landscape around them. A myth told in ancient Egypt could cross seas, travel through deserts, and find itself in the courts of kings and emperors, transformed along the way by new beliefs, new cultures, and new voices. The gods of Egypt, once part of a strict pantheon, found their way into the hearts of other people, reshaped into deities of a different nature, even finding themselves at the root of other religions and philosophies. The story of Osiris and Isis, for instance, didn't just belong to Egypt. It was absorbed and adapted by the Greeks, the Romans, and later, even by Christianity. In one version, Osiris was a god of rebirth, a symbol of life's eternal cycle. In another, he became a figure of the afterlife, his resurrection a foreshadowing of Christ's own death and return. Myths are fluid like this, able to speak to universal truths, life, death, love, sacrifice, that stretch across cultures, across time. But it isn't only through history that myths change. They shift within the people who tell them. A myth told by a child on a cold winter's night has a different weight than the same myth recited by an elder at dawn. The meaning of a myth is not fixed, not even in the hearts of those who first hear it. It is fluid, shaped by the lives of those who tell it. Every generation reinvents its myths, giving them fresh meaning in light of its own experiences, anxieties, and aspirations. Take, for instance, the transformation of the myth of Persephone. Once, she was a young girl, stolen by Hades, a victim of a dark fate, a goddess trapped between two worlds. But over time, the story of her abduction became something more. She was no longer merely a symbol of innocence lost, but a powerful figure in her own right. In the modern era, some have seen Persephone's descent to the underworld not just as a loss, but as an act of choice, her power to navigate between life and death, light and darkness, an empowering journey of self-realization. The Greek myths of the gods have shifted too. Zeus, once the king of gods, revered and feared, has taken on new forms in popular culture. In the hands of modern writers and filmmakers, he is no longer the wise, omnipotent ruler. Instead, he often becomes a flawed and relatable figure, battling with his own desires, weaknesses, and fears. Even the gods of Mount Olympus, with all their ancient power, have transformed to fit a new world. Even outside of Western traditions, myths bend and adapt in extraordinary ways. In the Norse myths, the gods were often seen as tragic figures, doomed to die in the inevitable Ragnarok. But as Viking stories made their way to distant shores, their gods became symbols of resistance, and eventually, those same figures found themselves in the pages of modern literature and cinema as symbols of rebellion and defiance, still carrying the weight of the old world, but newly empowered by contemporary struggles. What makes myths so powerful is their ability to change, to adapt. They are not stagnant, they breathe with the times, shifting with the world around them. They respond to the shifting tides of human thought, reflecting the values, fears, and hopes of the generations that carry them forward. They don't just stay confined to the pages of ancient scrolls or the stones of old temples. They live in every retelling, every reinterpretation, and in every person who finds their own truth within those stories. In this way, myths aren't bound by their past. They're part of something larger than the stories themselves, an eternal narrative that evolves to match the needs of each era. When you think of Persephone, or Heracles, or Osiris, you aren't just recalling characters from the past, you're witnessing their transformation. You're witnessing their rebirth in every new form they take, and every new soul they touch. Myths are like the pulse of humanity, always present, always shifting, forever with us, whether we realize it or not. And they will continue to adapt, bending and twisting with the winds of time, carrying us into futures we haven't yet imagined. They are the stories we tell to understand ourselves, the truths we shape to make sense of our world. And as long as humanity breathes, these myths will continue to evolve, just as we do. It's astonishing, really, how the echo of ancient gods still vibrates in the world today. We don't hear their voices, but we feel their presence. When we speak of love, war, or fate, the threads of Greek and Roman mythologies are woven into the very fabric of our thoughts, our stories, our struggles. Those myths, so far removed from us in time, still live inside us. More than just stories, they are blueprints of our human experience. These gods, heroes, and monsters were not just characters, they were reflections of who we were and, in many ways, who we still are. Take a moment to think about the last time you saw a superhero movie. A mighty figure with godlike powers, fighting for justice. Were you drawn to the story because of the battles or the power? Or did you feel something deeper, the same energy that courses through the myths of old? Zeus' thunderbolts now take the form of powerful heroes wielding weapons that defy nature. But when you strip away the costumes, the CGI, and the flashy effects, you will realize something that stirs deep inside you. You are watching the same battles fought by gods and mortals in ancient Greece. The characters may have changed, but the emotions, the fear, the hope, the desire for love, justice, and immortality remain timeless. It's not just the names or the stories that have endured. What has carried through centuries is the very essence of these myths, the raw truths they tell about being human. When we hear of the great love story of Orpheus and Eurydice, we don't just hear of a man's grief and his tragic fate. We hear of our own capacity to love so deeply that it pulls us toward impossible choices, toward hope and despair that intertwine, creating a story that doesn't simply belong to the past. It belongs to anyone who has ever loved, lost, or fought against impossible odds. And what of the great trials of Heracles? His 12 labors were not just challenges set by gods, they were representations of the human condition, tasks that seemed insurmountable, but through perseverance, through strength, and even through moments of doubt, they became the very thing that shaped his legacy. It's the same with us, isn't it? We face challenges every day. Some are external, fighting to find a job, to keep a family together, to survive loss. Others are internal, battles within ourselves, between fear and courage, doubt and faith. But the legacy of Heracles endures, a reminder that while the trials may change, the strength to face them is what shapes us. The myth of the Trojan War is another one that resonates. It's a story of cities burning, of friendships torn apart, of betrayal and vengeance. But, more than that, it is a story of humanity's constant fight with its own impulses, the need for glory, the hunger for power, the unyielding push towards self-destruction. That's what we see in the world today, too. The Trojan horse, a symbol of cunning, has morphed into corporate tricks, political deception, and personal manipulation. The names and places have changed, but we're still fighting the same wars, driven by the same desires and fears. Every age faces its own version of Troy, just as every individual faces their own choices between honor and betrayal, love and hatred. There's something deeply humbling about these myths. They remind us that we are not new to this world. Our struggles, our dreams, our fears have been lived before, carried in the voices of gods and heroes who lived in the age of myths. The gods of Olympus, for all their might, were driven by very human emotions: jealousy, love, fear, rage. They were not perfect, just as we are not perfect. And yet, they were worshipped, remembered, and immortalized in story. That's the power of myth. It allows us to see our flaws and our strengths reflected in something greater, something divine, yet still human. Look at the way the Romans reinterpreted Greek myths. At first, they seemed to only change the names, giving Greek gods Roman counterparts. Zeus became Jupiter, Aphrodite became Venus. But if you look closely, you'll see something more. The Romans didn't just mimic the Greeks, they used these myths to reinforce their own identity, to shape their empire, and to justify their conquests. The gods weren't just symbols, they were tools of power. And yet, the deeper meanings of these stories, their lessons on honor, duty, and sacrifice, spoke not only to the Roman legions, but to the hearts of every person, every generation, that dared to listen. Even today, The myths continue to offer us something priceless, the ability to reflect. To see ourselves in the battles of gods and the lives of mortals who strive against fate. They remind us that we are part of something far larger than ourselves. The past may be gone, but the feelings, the stories, the lessons continue to flow through us. We are not alone in our grief, our joy, our quest for meaning. The gods have been there, walked through the same emotions, fought the same battles, and come out the other side, sometimes triumphant, sometimes broken, but always changed. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson these ancient myths can teach us today. That we, too, are part of a grand narrative. That every moment, every struggle, every victory is part of a much larger story that stretches across time, linking us to heroes and gods who, in their pain, their love, their failures, and triumphs, are not so different from us. Their stories are not confined to ancient scrolls or ruins. They live within us, in the choices we make, in the legacies we build, and in the myths we continue to create. We often look to the past for guidance, for wisdom, as if the answers are locked away in the stories of old. But maybe the truth is simpler. The myths don't just teach us about the past, they teach us about ourselves. In every myth, every god, every hero, there is a piece of our own journey waiting to be discovered. The world may change, but the stories, the heart of these myths, will remain with us forever, living in the very soul of humanity, echoing through the ages.